Okay, welcome everybody, and thank you for joining us for our live seminar and webinar on withdrawal liability. I'm Lori Rawlings, the Executive Director of PMC SMACCA. If you're listening via webinar today, could you raise your hand using your control panel and just let me know that you can hear us? In the meantime, I'm going to turn it over to our presenter, Mike McNally, who is an attorney with the Fellhaber Larson firm in Minneapolis. He's a labor lawyer who also specializes in ERISA matters, so he's very familiar with this concept of withdrawal liability, pension funds, and how it affects your business. So please join me in welcoming Mike McNally. Thanks for being here, Mike.
Thank you all. Lori, thank you first for having me.
Sure.
You all are in very capable hands here. I work with a lot of chapter executives, both in the sheet metal and other trades, and I think Lori is one of the best. I'm not just saying that because she's sitting right here.
And I didn't pay him to say that, so thanks, Mike. That's
not yet paid.
It's very complimentary. I did buy him lunch.
Yeah. So we obviously have a small group here, and then we have some folks who are listening online. And with that, I would encourage you to, if at any point there's something that I'm kind of talking about that you're kind of not getting, scratching your head, please just interrupt. We can make this as casual, just like we're having a little chat here. So about me, as Lori said, I'm an attorney. I work with a law firm out of the Twin Cities. Our firm, I work in labor and benefits law. Our firm is counsel to SMACCA National, so we work a lot in the sheet metal industry, work with a lot of employers. I work particularly a lot with withdrawal liability matters, so helping employers understand exactly what this means, and in particular helping them understand how to transfer their business, how to do kind of intergenerational succession planning, or buying a competitor, or selling to a competitor. So when you're having those thoughts about, geez, I want to sell my business, and I got it valued at 4 times EBITDA and all that, and then all of a sudden your buyer comes back and says, but you have that 7-figure withdrawal liability number, so let's take that off the top, and in fact your business is worth nothing. Those kind of conversations. What we're going to do today is I think we'll kind of maybe try and structure this a little bit like a hockey game. Is we'll kind of take a few breaks here in between, so maybe we'll take 2 or 3 breaks depending on how folks' eyes are looking. I would, we'll kind of work through some of the mechanics of withdrawal liability, help you understand the concept, help you understand how it's calculated, how it's paid, and then kind of talk to you a little bit about how when you're having those, I want to sell my business, I want to buy a competitor, how do I do that, how does this factor into that, help you understand that a little bit. One thing I would point out, or I would say off the beginning, this is, withdrawal liability is it's kind of like a technical topic, as you'll see it's very dry, very complicated. So this is not the kind of thing where when you go to, you go to sell your business, if you go to like a business broker, or you go to your accountant, you go even to your lawyer, this is not the kind of stuff where you go to like the attorney who did like your buddy's divorce, a little kind of high-end type of stuff. So it doesn't mean you have to use me, but when you see folks who get some bad advice here, you feel it's real unfortunate series of events when you get some bad advice from somebody who didn't really know what they were doing, whom you relied on. So just keep that in mind when you start to think about this. So, like I said, we're going to kind of talk initially about understanding withdrawal liability. When does it get paid? Under what circumstances does it ever do? We're going to talk about building construction industry exemption, calculation of payment, and then sales and transfers. I know that some of you all here, so we have some sheet metal guys in the room. I gather some folks who are signatory to other trades too, and mechanical and plumbing, or electrical rather. Because of, we could talk about each and every one of the pension funds that you all contribute to, but kind of for purposes of keeping this within a one-day presentation, we're going to focus on the Sheet Metal Workers National Pension Fund. When we talk about some of our examples, we talk about some numbers, we're going to use that as an example. Withdrawal liability. So my goal when you leave here today is to have you there are perhaps some of you who are in the room here who have a little bit of understanding what's going on. Some of you probably have no idea or kind of just totally unfamiliar with it. So my goal is when you leave here, you know a little bit more than when you walked in. So we'll bridge that knowledge gap a little bit, and to the extent that you need some more tutoring, we're happy to do that too. The this is something that I think is tough for folks to understand. So some of you, I've heard the reaction before to, well, what do you mean I have to pay more to the pension fund? I paid all my contributions on time, and there was that one time where the bookkeeper was out on maternity leave and we were late one time, but that was just one time. So I paid everything I was supposed to. I was never delinquent. Why do I owe you more? So that's kind of an important issue that I think a lot of people struggle with. So withdrawal liability is a statutory creation called the Multi-Employer Pension Plan Amendments Act of 1980, or called MEPA. So this was this law that was put into, that was enacted by Congress with the objective of protecting the retirees and participants in multi-employer defined benefit pension plans. So we're talking about defined benefit pension plans, so not our defined contribution 401ks, it's just defined benefits. So I try and use a couple analogies to explain this, and so I'll try one that I think has had some traction. So imagine we are all at a self-serve diner, and at this diner, each of us has a cup of coffee, our plate, and our knife and fork. And this diner, self-serve diner, when you're done with your your plate, you got to bus your own table. You got to put your dishes back. And so, if, for example, I left and didn't bus my own dishes, well, then one of you all is going to have to clean that up. And then say, Lori left next, and she didn't bus her dish either. These dishes got to get cleaned and washed. Else, when the next customers come in, there's no dishes because they're not clean. And if this kind of continues, the last man standing has got these dishes. I got to clean up all these dishes. They're not mine. All of you guys left and didn't clean your dishes. So withdrawal liability, if you kind of substitute dirty dishes for unfunded vested benefits, the idea is if I leave a pension fund, if I exit that pension fund, and I have some dirty dishes, or the pension fund is underfunded, meaning that there's not enough money to pay the benefits that are due, you have to pay for your slice, or the amount of dirty dishes you had when you leave. So that's kind of a concept. And I'm seeing some nodding, so I think that makes a little bit of sense. But so you think about dirty dishes, you think about, okay, so this pension fund is underfunded, so I have to pay when I leave. So maybe some of the things that you're asking yourself is, well, how come, why is the pension fund underfunded? What happened here? How did it get to be? And we'll talk about that. You want to push us forward there?
Yeah, sorry, I'm having some technical difficulties.
It's okay. So withdrawal liability is, so for FASB purposes, for your financial accounting statements, withdrawal liability is considered what's called a contingent liability. So your financials don't have that as an above-the-line number. It's not reflected anywhere. Your books don't show I have this withdrawal liability to National Pension Fund or any other. So contingent liability, which means basically that you don't have to disclose it. It may be something that if you're going to get financing or you're going to sell your business or buy a business, that may factor into the conversation of, well, what's your withdrawal liability, but it is, for FASB purposes, considered a contingent liability. And so the contingent nature of that is, I think, is very important to emphasize. So it is a liability that is only triggered if you want to trigger it. So that liability only comes due when you affirmatively take some steps. And we'll talk about that. There are some very rare exceptions, but it basically only happens if you decide to cease contributing to a pension fund. So if you decide to terminate your pension fund contribution because you close the business, because you want to operate non-union, or because you don't want to contribute to a pension fund on behalf of your workers, but you're happy to apply the other terms of the collective bargaining agreement. But the pension fund thing is not something you're interested in. So only if you decide to stop paying money into the fund does that liability kind of trigger.
So for a C corp, it's the liability of the corporation itself.
That's right. So, and we'll talk about, there's a concept called control group. So there are these Internal Revenue Code terms. We'll talk about under who gets tagged with this liability. So generally, right, it's the corporation's liability. It's not personal in nature, but there are obviously circumstances.
There is a control group.
Correct, yes. So everyone who could possibly fit within a control group is liable for it. So push this forward. So underfunding of a pension fund. So how come this pension fund is underfunded? Why isn't there enough money in there? Why didn't whose fault is this? It's the, so some of the things we hear, it's the union's fault, it's the actuary's fault, it's the investment professional's fault, it's the lawyer's fault, it's the union's fault again.
I agree with all those.
Yeah, everyone's fault.
Especially the lawyer's fault.
It's certainly not yours because you paid your money when it was due. It's any number of people's faults. But what happened here? Where did things go, sideways here? So if you think about this, this is one of the critical concepts. So if you take nothing away from today, maybe you'll think about it. I understand. He explained why these things are underfunded. It makes a little bit of sense. And you hear a lot about this in the news, even nowadays with public pensions, how they're in so much trouble. So the structure of a defined benefit pension plan is when I retire, I'm guaranteed for life until I die to get X dollars a month. So unlike, I'm not fortunate enough to have a defined benefit pension plan I was, but my 401k, that's all the money I got. And if it doesn't last me until I'm dead, tough. But that defined benefit pension plan is going to keep there until I'm in the grave. So that is that's an important. That is challenging. So we have mortality rates. There are these mortality tables the actuaries use. So they figure out, all right, well, folks are normally living to this in this geographic area. Men live this long, women live this long, and how long, what trade, what industry are we in? So there's tables that actuaries use to project how long people are going to live. They are updated every 10 years. So most recently there was it was a 2015 mortality table update which said that the average age I think is now somewhere in the 80s, and it was in the 70s, now 70s. So now all of a sudden this pension fund has to kick out an extra 5 years for the average guy who's going to live an extra 5 years longer. So now they have to come up with 5 more years worth of payments. Okay, so think about mortality tables. Think about the challenge and the uncertainty that goes along with that. Another thing, this is a big one, changes in accrual rates. So as you know, or as I shouldn't say the way a pension fund works is that and they're structured in any number of different ways, but I accrue service credits based on the hours or contributions that my employer makes on my behalf. So there are a certain number of hours where you accrue a credit. Say, for example, it's 1,000 hours, you get 1 credit. That credit, if you earn it in 2017, is worth a specified dollar amount. So that's called the accrual rate. So that credit accrues and will pay me a benefit on retirement at that rate. Back a long time ago, before these things were kind of in the situation they're in, it was pretty common to have these kind of retroactive increases. So pension funds would say, geez, we're overfunded. So we need to actually increase the accrual rate retroactively. So it used to be $100 a credit, let's bump it to $110. And that was kind of common. Nowadays, it's obviously going the other direction. So changes in accrual rates, actuarial assumptions. So actuaries are the people that the plans rely on basically to forecast mortality rates, take in how much contribution dollars they figure they're going to get, at what rates, how long are people going to live, apply some assumptions on what interest rates are, what projected rates of return are going to be, a lot of assumptions are going in here, and the more assumptions you stack on top of each other, the more uncertain it gets. So you have some actuarial math that's being done that, you know, is been, I think a lot of the, particularly the public pension plans, a lot of people point to the actuarial assumptions that are used and say, the reason is that the actuaries were overly rosy on any number of things. Investment return. So the investment return, you know, so if you think about what a pension fund anticipates the dollars coming in today are going to earn, so what if I'm working today, what my employer remitting on my behalf, how much that money is going to grow over my lifetime until I retire, what rate would you assume, you know, they could get? What would be a safe assumption?
Should be 3 to 4%.
And do you know what they use?
7 or 8%?
7, 7.5, 8. So if you're aiming for a 7.5% bogey, and you're at 5, 6, you start to get underfunded quickly, and so the actuary is relying on the investment professional to get them that 7.5, because he's assuming that that money that's coming in is going to grow and is going to be able to pay for those benefits, and that's not the case, because 2008 happens, or because you know, bond prices fall, or any number of reasons. You know, the market. If any of us knew exactly how to you know, how to figure that out, we would be millionaires. We wouldn't be here. So they assume these investment returns that are sometimes not achieved. You know, think about this too. So, you know, a lot of people talk about, you know, so my 401k, for example, in 2008 took a big hit, and you know, it was up here and went boom, it went way down. But you know, times have changed and it's back up, and perhaps it's a little bit, you know, ahead of where it was. The problem with the pension fund is that not only did it lose that money, perhaps it got back up, but there was that time and space where it wasn't growing. So it was operating in a deficit, basically. It had assumed that for all those years between 08 and 17, it was going to grow at 7.5, and perhaps it was, but it was still rebounding from 08. So there's catching up to do. You know, and so a way I explain this to, you know, to my wife, and not that she's not sophisticated, but the way I explain withdrawal liability is like this: is it's a lot like a Ponzi scheme in that, and it's got a negative connotation, but you know, it certainly is, in that the way we're paying out retirees currently is sometimes a lot of the dollars coming in the door from our current actives are being used to pay for what we call legacy costs for our retirees. And depending on what we call the maturity of the plan, the maturity is like I think a nice way of saying there's a lot of old people and there's no young people. But if you have like what's called a mature plan, so your ratio of inactives to actives gets up above 1.5, you get to 1.75, you get to 2, you're in trouble. So if you have 2 retirees for every active, you know, how's that going to work? It's not going to last very long. It becomes very challenging. So Ponzi scheme is, you know, a pejorative term, I think, but it's kind of how it works sometimes depending upon the demographics of the plan. So contribution hours, they assume that, you know, you know, as you know, and it depends on, you know, geographics too, union marketplace is challenging, particularly in the construction industry. There's not always the, you know, they assume that there will continue to be, you know, dollars and hours, and construction ebbs and flows, and it's not always predictable. We know what our pipeline is going to be perhaps a year or 2 out, 3 maybe. Beyond that, who knows? So where they're relying on these, again, I'm going back to assumptions, where they're relying on forecasts of what contribution hours are going to be times the contribution rate, you know, where that kind of breaks down is, you know, there's a you know, we go into a recession, so our investment return falls off, our contribution hours fall off. You know, you get 2 big strikes there, obviously. And then, you know, perhaps we get a big, you know, we start facing more non-union competition. contribution hours, but I need a little bit more. So contribution hours is an important part in this whole calculus. Employer bankruptcies. So the guy who I leave the diner, I don't clean my dishes. I say, see ya. And you guys say, no, you gotta clean your dishes. You try and catch me. And I'm in my car, I'm gone. That's effectively a bankruptcy. So instead of those dirty dishes, if I exit the pension fund because I'm broke, I ran out of money, I can't pay it. Sorry guys. You all get to share in my dirty dishes. So that gets kind of spread amongst all of you. And employer bankruptcies, that happens a lot. So interest rates, this is a pretty critical one that we'll spend a little bit of time talking about. It's a bit of a heady topic, but when we think about how plans value or discount what the liabilities are going to be, interest rates, PBGC interest rates are, kind of drive a lot of that analysis. Interest rates, as you all know, are at record lows. Not record, but they're quite low. So that has the effect of producing larger present values of numbers, discounting back at those very low rates. So interest rates have in particular for the withdrawal liability valuation method that the Sheet Metal Workers National Pension Fund uses, those very low interest rates have a tremendous effect on what employer withdrawal liability means. So another one of my metaphors, so along with the diner, along with me leaving with the my dirty dishes, so if you think about this pizza pie, if you think about that as the plan's unfunded vested benefits. So if you think about, all what the difference is between the benefits that the plan has promised to pay and the assets that it has, think about that amount. Think about that as like a pizza. And when you leave, you take your slice of the pie with you. So your allocable share of the plan's unfunded vested benefits, that's yours. And as that pizza pie grows, so too does your slice, the size of your slice. So when we value withdrawal liability, the way that it works is, if I had, again, back to our diner metaphor, if I was really hungry and I had 2 dishes, I had 2 cups of coffee, say for example, and Laura, you only had 1. When I leave, I have to clean 2 cups of coffee because I had to, but Lori only had to clean 1 because she only had 1. And if you think about that, if I'm a really large employer and I contribute a lot of money to that pension fund that I leave, and Lori is a smaller employer and she contributes much less, my allocable share of that pizza pie is going to be proportionate to how much I contribute. Lori's going to be smaller, mine's going to be bigger. So think about pizza pie, slice, size of your slice depends on how bad the plan is underfunded, how much you put into it. So we're going to start talking some numbers here.
If somebody had 100 guys and another guy had 12 guys, that's what you're talking about there?
Correct. Yep. And with that too goes, so if you had 100 guys and think about the National Pension Fund, there are different contribution rates for areas across the country. Some areas put in $12, some areas put in $1. It's not just the number of guys, but your guys, your man hours times your contribution rate. So,
And your location.
yeah, so doing the math, the contractor who's in one area who puts in $12 an hour but only has 10 guys versus the guy who's got 100 guys but only puts in whatever that is, $1.20, they might be the same, but it's how much you put in times the number of man hours. So, so we start getting into numbers, and before we do that, and I start glazing over, I want to take a chance to see if we got questions. So we're kind of going through the concept here and trying to make this, kind of introduce it a little bit. Sure.
So I'm thinking it's an insurance plan basically. everybody puts in a pot, whoever takes out early leaves the plan for everybody else to fulfill.
Yeah, that's certainly a way to think about it. Yeah.
The post office, their issue with their pension program and the debts owed. You talked about the issue of the legacy workers and that kind of a thing. Is it that they ran into the same issue? It's not like a multi-employer plan, but it is in a sense that there's multiple entities in post office areas that are putting into the plan. When they were demanded to have the money up front and they don't have it, is that not in effect the same kind of thing? It's just a sooner issue than later?
You know, I apologize. I'm not too familiar with the pension fund or the post office.
Yeah, they're basically bankrupt because they cannot provide the money for the benefits that they owe, and they need to have it now versus pushing it off later.
Okay.
You know what I mean?
Yeah. So we'll talk about. So there's another pension fund. It's called the Central States Teamsters Pension Fund, which is in a similar type predicament. We'll talk about that. But essentially, the way that pension fund is because of any number of reasons, because of Wall Street, the lawyer, whatever else, the interest rates, all that, deregulation of the trucking industry. What happened is, the ratio there is more than 2 to 1. So the ratio of inactives to actives. So we've got one guy paying in money that's supposed to pay out for 2 people. Employers, contribution rates keep going up, so employer bankruptcies keep going up, and basically employers are saying, we can't keep paying for these other people who are retired. And I think that's kind of what you were describing, is that perhaps the post office plan would say, we need more money, we need it now, we can't wait till later. And that obviously is, we don't have a lot of trees just to rip money off and pay in the plan. So again, we're going to use the Sheet Metal Workers National Pension Fund as our kind of example here. I know, at least for your sheet metal folks and perhaps for your mechanical folks too, you all participate in the multi-craft fund here, and I know that you guys did a podcast that kind of covered that. So again, Sheet Metal Workers National Pension Fund. These are some numbers. These are some years. Kind of the big takeaway points from this chart. The unfunded vested benefits, meaning the difference between the benefits which the plan has promised to pay and the assets it has is $4.8 billion.
Yikes.
So, so that's quite a staggering number, and we're going to kind of get into exactly what that number means, how does that get calculated, and all that stuff. But so kind of not that we don't all need the tissues to wipe away our tears quite yet.
You might need those tissues, Henry. You're not in that pension plan, thank God.
But this is our Sheet Metal Workers National Pension Fund unfunded vested benefits. This is as of the valuation for the end of the 2015 plan year. So this is certainly it's not as though these pension funds get remarkably better, at least not in the near term. So perhaps 2016 data is going to show improvement, but there's also a good likelihood it's not going to be an improvement at all, and it'll probably be a little worse.
This is for all of the United States, right?
That's right.
All.
Yes.
This is like the international.
Correct. Yeah.
So is there a percentage assigned to that?
Sorry.
So is there a percentage assigned to where they're at on funding?
Good question. This is my plant here. Yeah. So.
Nice job, Joe.
Thank you very much for that. So we'll shoot forward here. So we'll talk about how. So you guys get these funding notices. Perhaps you get these mailers from the plan that says the plan is 50% funded, 80% funded. Your multi-craft, I think, is 75% funded. It's considered green. What do these numbers mean? What are these colors they're attaching to these things? So our National Pension Fund for the 2016 plan year was certified as what's called endangered. Endangered means yellow zone status. So there are 3 zones that the Pension Protection Act of 2006 put out there. Green is the best. Green means basically above 80% funded. Yellow means somewhere between, depending on how you do the numbers, 79% and like 65%. And then below that is red. And below that is what we call gray, or critical and declining status. So this so PPA is a law that governs pensions. It's important, but it's also misleading, and we'll show you why that is. So one thing is, I'll hear folks say, well, the pension fund is better. The pension fund went from red to yellow, or yellow to green, or it's now 60% funded instead of 50. So that means my withdrawal liability went down, right? Not always. Depends on the withdrawal liability valuation method that they use. And we'll talk about how for the National Pension Fund, this isn't a good barometer for that. More importantly is interest rates. So when you look at this and you look at your National Pension Fund, and if you're saying to yourself, oh man, it's yellow, great. I don't mean to get the tissues out again, but it's not exactly, it's a little misleading. And
There was no payback when it was in yellow status back in 2000. It
no,
wasn't until it went red before we had to start paying back into it. I remember that.
okay.
Is that when the funding improvement plan came into place? Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
Because until it went red, we didn't have to start paying back into it. When it was yellow, we didn't have to pay anything. That was before you, that was when Peter was here. So that's why I don't understand why all of a sudden we have to go to 80% now when it was at 50 back in 2002.
So you're referring to contribution increases or surcharges?
Right.
Yeah, so again, Pension Protection Act, 3 zones, green, yellow, red. If you're green, you're good, you don't have to do anything. If you're yellow, you have to do what's called a funding improvement plan. If you're red, you have to do what's called a rehabilitation plan. The names are, as they suggest, designed to improve or help the plan get better. How do they do that? How do you improve a plan's funding status? You kill retirees.
That's my choice.
Guys start working more hours. We tell them, get out there and work. That's not, we can't do that either. It's a little better than killing people. Or you pay more money. You start paying more money into the plan. So what those contribution increases that you're referring to were required under this rehabilitation plan. So currently, if you guys are under the first alternative for national
Yes.
pension. So currently under the National Pension Fund, for the first alternative for the funding improvement plan, or the rehabilitation. So it was the funding improvement plan. You have been paying 7% increases.
Yes.
So each year you hit a 7%, 7%, 7%. There are no anticipated increases for 16, 17, or 18. So hopefully that is done. But again, so that was designed to help get things back where they should be, help improve that to get it from red to yellow. So I think that's probably what you're referring to. Just to kind of a couple other things to talk about the National Pension Fund, kind of aside from withdrawal liability. When you look at kind of pension funds, I think it's important to always kind of take a macro, zoom out as far as you can, look at trend lines. Don't look at kind of things don't look at year to year, look at the 5-year, the 10-year, the 20-year. A national pension fund, you kind of zoom out, it's on the right track. It's going in the right direction. It's going to take a generation to get up there. It's going to take a generation or perhaps 2 to get, maybe green or to get, to kind of fully funded. And that's assuming all those assumptions, that are perhaps may not come true. All those assumptions come true. A generation or 2 from now, it'll be back up where it should. One thing that the trustees did that was actually pretty progressive, and they're one of the few building trades national pension funds that's done this, is the V-bar, with a variable benefit accrual rate. So perhaps you've heard of this. So the variable benefit accrual rate is this. My 401k, if the market tanks, so does my 401k. If I had a defined benefit pension, doesn't matter what the market did. I'm still getting that money at the accrual rates for life. The V-bar, what's that intended to do is it's intended to use a 3-year trailing average, look back and say, all right, what was the return in the 3 prior years? Was it 0? Was it? And there's 3 different kind of sets, and 3 different kind of ranges. And depending on which of those it falls into is what your accrual rate is at for your contribution. So if the market return for the 3-year trailing average is good, show us your accrual. If it's not, your accrual won't be either. It could be 0. So this variable benefit accrual rate is essentially a little bit of a hybrid between a defined benefit and a defined contribution. It is intended to kind of, if you think about it, a leaky pipe almost. It's intended to kind of cap that and prevent future underfunding from continuing to grow. It's a little bit of a new model. There's not like 20 or 30 years of data really to study too much on this. But the intent is that it will kind of prevent these the funds that have adopted it, from becoming further underfunded. So that's all we kind of wanted to talk about for national pension in terms of some bigger picture items. So these are our PPA funded percentages for the 3 most recent plan years, 15, 14, and 13. You can again look at these trend lines and see, 57 to 59, we got almost a 2% increase. And I know that doesn't sound a lot, but when you have a pension fund that has many $billion, and you're kind of coming out of a bit of a, we're just kind of coming out of, I think, the recession period there. Depends obviously on everyone's region, but in general, 11, 12, 13, we're finally starting to clipping along. A little bit of a market dip here, combined with kind of some strong man hours. The trend lines are going in the right direction. These things, asterisks, we'll talk about. These are what's called actuarial values. So actuarial values are ways that actuaries will present data that is, what they do is they call this smoothing. So if you think about a pension fund, in 2008, it went like boom, it went down terribly, and they had these losses. And so what they could do is they could amortize those massive 2008 losses over 10 years. So take out a $10 million hit, and you can whack up that loss over 10 years. So you can kind of amortize that or smooth that. So that's what these values mean. These aren't market values. These are actuarial values. Market values go like this every day, or that, or that. This, again, is kind of an actuarial smoothing value. So, it's not like the most, it's a little confusing, I think, but if you kind of look at this, you might, if you were to kind of, I think we'll have some more data in one of our slides, but if you kind of look at this and consider the actual market value of the assets today versus the actual liabilities, that it's closer to a 50% funded. So this actuarial smoothing, I think, generally tries to make things look a little bit more good than they are.
Is that why, Mike, on an earlier slide, the big chart you showed at the bottom, there was a $4.8 billion underfunding? But if you look in 2015, the value of liabilities compared to the value of assets, that only looks like a $2.8 billion difference. Is that because of the smoothing? or is that something different?
Yeah, so, and the way that those, so that slide, so if you go back to that slide, I'll show you exactly what's going on. So this thing is,
Sorry.
yes, that one. So,
Yeah. Sorry.
so what's going on here is we're going back to 2009, and what it is they established what's called pools. Actuaries use this thing called pool. So each year they'll decide, all right, how much liabilities did we have in that year versus how much assets did we have. They establish a pool each year, and this is called a basic pool. I realize that we're getting I'm trying to play actuary here, but my kind of layman's understanding of it is that when that 4.8 billion is computed, it is essentially figuring out how much underfunding or how many pools were established each year in the last 16 years. So it's kind of like a long run of that versus the PPA kind of stuff is just basically a snapshot in time. It's just that number today.
Okay.
If that helps answer it a little bit.
Sorry.
All right, I'm going to shoot us forward maybe 2 more.
Yep. Oops. Sorry. One moment, please.
So what we're going to talk about on this slide is we talked a little bit about how there's a bit of a disconnect between how underfunded a plan is for PPA purposes versus how underfunded a plan is for withdrawal liability purposes. So I explained to you a little bit that, because a plan is better funded doesn't always mean that the withdrawal liability is going down. So these are 3 different ways. So stop.
Sorry.
Okay. These are 3 different ways that you can kind of, 3 different ways you can think about the plan's funding, okay? So you got a PPA zone certification that says the plan is 59.3% funded. What does that mean? Is there another way to run that same math? Is that overly rosy? Are there other ways to value that? How exactly do you value the future, how exactly are you valuing, discounting back those benefits? And we can talk about each of these, but just the concept is these are 4 different ways that you can show 4 different kind of metrics to show the health of a plan. Okay. So here we have our PPA number, right? So this is the actuary. This is relying on actuarial numbers, actuarial smoothing for our asset, actuarial value for our assets, and actuarial smoothing for our liabilities. If we then look at the current liability, so what the current liability talks about is that if we basically had to go out and use the assets we had and buy basically annuities to pay off everyone, we had to go out and basically say, for example, the fund just shut down today, nobody else contributed, the plan stopped, for whatever reason. Current liability is basically a measure of that. It's closer to 34%. And again, that's because of our really low PBGC rates. These are, just kind of, so when, you start getting really in depth and talking about a plan, you can look at any number of things different ways. Like, if any of you guys, watch baseball, there's any number of stats, right, to tell how good of a pitcher, or a batter somebody is. Same thing's true for a pension fund. You can come up with 40 different metrics. I don't know that there's one that's more important than any of them, but I think they're all important to see. I think what I would tell you is that, again, look at our trend lines. We're kind of going in the right direction. It's not like we're doing awesome, but we're doing a little better. So I think what we'll do here, we'll kind of introduce this topic and then maybe we'll take a little break. So we talk about unfunded vested benefits. So again, that is the difference between what the plan has for money versus what it owes for benefits. And that's what's called our unfunded, or benefits for which the plan does not have money. There are no dollars associated with those payments to retirees. It's an unfunded, a vested pension, and then benefits, obviously. So how do you value those plans? What interest rates do you use? So think about this. You have a future benefit that you have to pay to someone. And you have to think about, all right, so the investment guy's telling me it's going to get 7.5. I know what the accrual rate is going to be for this benefit now. How do I, I know some mortality tables with life expectancies, etc. How do I turn that future benefit into a present value? What kind of math should I be doing there? What interest rate should I apply? And there are two main ways that's done. The first is called the plan funding method. So the plan funding method assumes that you will discount back that future liability, what those future benefit payments are going to be. Discount that back at if the fund's interest investment rate, assumed rate of return rather, is 7.5. Discount that back 7.5%. Okay. So discounting it back at that, when you discount back a larger number, the present value is much lower, versus if you're discounting back at a lower number, it's much higher. Plan funding method is a method that is pretty commonly used for a lot of pension funds. I don't know exactly what your guys' multi-credit fund uses.
Good question. I don't know either.
But the National Pension Fund uses what's called the Siegel blend method, and we will bore you quite a bit here. But this is like a critical takeaway here for understanding this, because this is how this Siegel blend method is one of the more critical drivers, I think, of the withdrawal liability numbers for sheet metal contractors in the National Pension Fund. This way of calculating this is really important. So, so we're going to kind of talk about that and help you understand exactly how that number is calculated, and get you a little bit of a sense of exactly what the actuaries do. And then what we'll do is we'll talk about, kind of how does that become due? What would I have to do in order to get that? And then obviously talk a little bit about selling or buying the business. So why don't we take a break? Any questions, please feel free to grab me.
All right. How long of a break should we take?
5 minutes.
5 minutes?
5 minutes.
All right. Those of you listening at home, we'll be back on the air in 5 minutes. Do you need coffee?
No, I'm good, thanks.
Mike,
Yeah.
One of the audience members has a question about the letter that just came out from the National Pension Fund. I don't know if you saw it, the one that Joyce sent us yesterday about, let me print it out, actually. Not Joyce, Joy.
This is a national.
So it's just the annual funding notice?
I think that's what she's talking about, because she said something about 30 years. The letter saying something about 30 years being required.
The 30 years refers to when you certify as endangered, which is yellow. If you're projected to go insolvent within 30 years, you would be a different certification. So that's all they're saying. You're not going to be insolvent in 30 years, so they're not critical declining status. They're endangered.
Okay, so maybe you might want to address that after the break. Huh. Wrong computer. Here we go.
They don't see.
That's right, exactly, that's what it says. They don't see it in the page, they don't see it.
Yeah, here the funding notice says it's not projected to become insolvent in 2016 plan year or any of the 30 succeeding plan years.
Right.
Do you want me to print this letter
Can
out?
we just give all the
No.
money to the guys and let them distribute it?
I can see what the problem is with this. It's the colors. Green should be 100%, not 80%.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's still underfunded, even if it's at 80, you know, in the green zone.
99% under, funded, it's still underfunded. So
Yeah, that's all, that's what the son says, it's what goes in their hand, that's all they consider is what they make.
So,
The benefits are.
why don't they just use one
Half a million.
plan, one method of doing these calculations? I mean, it seems like these plans are so heavily regulated by ERISA. They should only have one way of
Yeah.
calculating things so you can compare apples to apples. Or is that a naive question?
I mean, I think it's, there are different methods that I think are appropriate in different interest rate climates.
Oh,
So
okay.
like, for example, the Siegel blend method was developed like in the 80s, 70s, when interest rates were in teens, so mortgage rates were
You didn't get any
15%
raise.
or something. So interest rates then, so the interest rates, when they used that method then, because there was such high interest rates, that had the effect of producing very low withdrawal liability numbers. Now, that's doing the opposite.
Oh, really? Interesting. Okay. Do we have everybody back? Chris, okay.
crawling
He's crying. That's why he doesn't want to come back in here until he stops crying. All right. Do you need to? We can wait a minute. You're good? Okay. Okay, welcome back from the break, everybody. I just want to address the question that Joyce had over the break regarding the most recent plan funding notice that came out from the National Pension Fund, and there was a reference in there to 30 years, and Mike was just talking about 5 years. So, Mike, can you kind of give us an explanation for what all that means?
Sure. So the National Pension Fund sent out their annual funding notice in April. It again said that the fund is certified as yellow or endangered status. What Laura's referring to is in there. It says that it will not project to become insolvent in 30 years. So there are all these tests for these different zones: green, yellow, red. One of the tests for yellow is that it won't become insolvent, meaning that it will continue to have sufficient assets to pay benefits for 30 years. So that's all that's one of the tests they basically just have to state in there in order to say that they the actuary certifies them as endangered.
In one of the previous slides, you showed those 4 methods of assessing the liability.
Yeah.
Is there any one of those that's the best method for assessing the liability, or is there a combination of a couple of those that give you a more accurate liability assessment?
So those are 4 methods that not wanting to play actuary here. So it's like one of those things like you don't want a carpenter like fixing your electric kind of thing. So I try to stay in my lane. These are 4 different tests. This is the one that the statute said. This is the one that Congress, in their wisdom, said this is how we should do this.
So just regard that one.
I don't know what your thoughts are on that, but
that's one that they use.
So that's the one that they are statutorily required to use for the purposes of certifying the fund's value. Are there more accurate measures? Sure. I think looking at the present value, which uses the present value method, will use the funding rate assumption, so it will discount these back. It's discounting liabilities back at, so there's no smoothing involved in this, there's no actuarial smoothing, this type of stuff. I think this is probably a better metric, that's my opinion. So just a lawyer.
For those of you on the webinar, Mike's referring to the present value of future benefits, or the first funding method on that slide.
Yeah. So what we're kind of going to turn to here is to talk about the Siegel blend.
Sounds like a coffee.
Disgusting coffee. So we talked a little about how you would we talked about how the fund is certified or valued for purposes of the annual funding notice or PPA, and what we're going to talk about here is how the fund determines what its how the fund counts or measures or calculates its unfunded vested benefits. So we have this concept of we have some money that we owe in the future, and we have to figure out how to present value that so we can tell how big that pizza pie is. So what we're doing here is we're trying to figure out how big is that pie? How many dirty dishes do we have? What's that math? How does that math work? I don't want any of you all to expect, you're going to come out of here and feel like an actuary and want to do this, but I think it's important for you to understand, a little bit about how this works, and understand a little bit why one of the most important drivers of this is interest rates, particularly now where we're in such a low interest rate climate. So again, we're figuring out how big our pizza pie is, okay? Our pizza pie is going to be calculated according to a couple methods. Funding method, Siegel blend method. National Pension Fund, Chief Metal Workers National Pension Fund uses Siegel blend method. All right, so this is from the 2016 or 2015 National Pension Fund Actuarial Withdrawal Liability Valuation Report. So these are actual numbers. I'm going to show you how this works, but here's kind of a recipe in short. Or rather, not short, it's not simple out there, but this is the recipe. They basically take the liabilities and figure them out in two different ways. So we take, we're trying to figure out a present value of these future benefits. So we have two different ways. We're going to calculate it twice. We're going to do it at the funding interest rate. Again, so our funding rate, we value something back at 7.5%. It's going to produce a much lower number. And then we also value it back, or discount it at these PBGC rates. There's a 20-year term and 20 plus. So these PBGC rates, so these PBGC rates are basically taken off of, what the Pension Benefit Guarantee Corporation sets them at. But they're essentially what the cost of buying an annuity is. So look at this. So we got the same valuation, valuing back the same number. Look at the difference here. So we're at $6 billion, we're at $13 billion. So we got two different numbers. So if you were in a pension fund that you choose the funding interest rate, the funding method, you would stop here. You would have your present value of your vested benefits. You would then go to, you would then basically figure out, all right, so that's my present value of my benefits. What do I have for assets? The delta there is my unfunded vested benefits. But here, they then take these two, one using the planned funding rate, one using PBGC rates. They take a look at what the market value of the assets are. So we have about $4 billion. And then what they do is we do what's called a weighting. So the weighting is basically is you determine what assets we have, the market value of the assets divided by the present value of the PBGC rates. So about $4 billion over about $13.5 billion gets you about 29.5%. So what we do then is we assume that those, so think about that. So we have $4 billion in assets, okay? And if we use the PBGC rates, we're way short. We got a mile to go. Versus if we use the funding rate assumption, we still got a long way to go, but we're a lot closer. When we take this number, we do this weighting, it's called. They basically try to apply a blend, a SMACCA blend, to figure out this present value. So we take the 29.4 times the present value. So we say for that amount, we're going to do 29.4 times that plus 70.6 times 1, and then that's going to give us a present value for withdrawal liability purposes. So taking a step back, we're doing some math here, but the important part of this is that the SMACCA blend method assumes essentially that the assets you have, so the plan has $4 billion in assets, right? So that assumes, this SMACCA blend method assumes, what should it assume? It should assume that the assets we have are going to earn, what's our planned funding assumption, 7.5? It assumes it should earn that, right? It doesn't. It assumes that the assets you have are going to grow at these PBGC rates, 3.5%, or 2.5% rather, which isn't, it's not going to grow very much. So it assumes they're going to grow at kind of a very reduced rate. And then it assumes that the assets we don't have, the difference between how much we have, how much money we have, and the amount we owe, it assumes that that's going to grow at 7.5%. So, Lori asked, well, why do they have these different methods? These rates here, this is like all-time lows, 2.5%, 3%. Back when before I was even born, these rates were double digits. So what would that do? That would have the effect of putting a ton of downward pressure on this number. this number would be lower than this one. So withdrawal liability numbers, when you have very high interest rate climates, are really low under this method. But nowadays, because these are so low, it props this number up a ton. And that's a huge thing that I think folks, kind of struggle with. Like I said before, you get your annual funding notice, great, the plan is now yellow or green or whatever, it's 59%, it's 60%. Does that mean my withdrawal liability number is going down? No, it doesn't. For the National Pension Fund, what drives your liability number a lot is this, is your PBGC rates or interest rates. So kind of turning back to our math here, if any of that made sense to you all, or why this method is used, feel free to offer your thoughts. I struggle with this a lot. The Siegel Company, some of you may know, is like one of the largest, or I think is the largest multi-employer actuarial consulting firm. This method, the Siegel blend method, was developed by a guy named Marty Siegel, who's the firm that took his namesake. This method was developed in the 80s when these rates were very different. And it made a lot of sense then. It doesn't make a lot of sense now, I think, because it overstates, I think, the number. Sure.
I'm sorry for being late, but are those rates subject to executive order so that President Trump can just sign something and raise the rates?
Good question, Jeff.
I suppose he seems to kind of do everything he wants to do. I mean, these are kind of market rates. These are what the market cost of those annuities are. I mean, I think the Fed is going to start taking some kind of forward action on the rates.
So what really influences the rate? It's a request to that.
The Fed. Yeah. What basically you can buy an annuity for.
So those aren't paid off at T-bill returns or anything?
So if I heard you right, that method actually exaggerates what the value would actually be in reality. It's 29%, I think you said it was. And when they do their smoothing or whatever,
yeah,
it exaggerates it up to that $13 billion number. Well, how is that truth in accounting?
Right. So there's a Supreme Court case that said that the assumptions and methods employed by an actuary must be their best estimate of anticipated experience under the plan. So what does that mean? So people have, so if I did this method and I told you, so if I'm a plan, say for example, I'm National Pension Fund, and I tell you your withdrawal liability is $5 million, you might say, well, that's ridiculous. Your method is stupid. If I did it under the funding rate assumption method, my withdrawal liability would be half that, 2.5. So I want to challenge your math. I want to tell you that you're wrong. Your actuary, that's not the best estimate. I think that it's imprudent for you to use rates when it's just completely doesn't make any sense, particularly nowadays. So people have tried that. When you have a lot of dollars, when you have a lot of money on the line, it makes a lot of sense to do that. And we've worked on those cases. And ultimately, Siegel's not going to let that method go down. Siegel's not going to let an arbitrator or a court ever tell them that their method doesn't reflect the anticipated experience. So what Siegel does is basically they come in and they bring in all their experts and try and defend it. This is not to
Bash Siegel.
Speak better of Siegel. I work with them a lot. I think they're good guys. I think the method's just doesn't make a lot of sense with the interest rate environment. So what's going to happen is basically they're going to, if I'm the fund and you're the employer, we're going to settle that case. You're never going to kind of get before someone who's going to slam the book on this.
How many companies have actually paid this withdrawal liability? That's what I would like to know. Are there any statistics that show this? How many companies in the United States have paid this?
To like the sheet metal workers now?
Yeah.
Sure, yeah. I mean, there are plenty of companies that do it in this industry and others because they,
Is there a database somewhere that shows, how many companies that actually paid withdrawal liability to get out of the fund?
In the plan's actuarial report each year, it will list the number of withdrawing employers. Doesn't mean that they all paid it. Some of them, an employer withdraws and it goes bankrupt. But, so there are, UPS withdrew from the Central States Teamsters Fund and paid like $8 billion because they thought that it made sense for them to get off now because that $8 billion was going to be 10, 12, 20 in a few years. So they kind of got out while they could. But yeah, people do pay it because they make a business decision that it's, I guess, in their best interest to do so. So, so Siegel blend method, I think, I don't expect anyone to, to go grab a beer with your buddy and listen to what I learned about that. Siegel blend, it's fascinating stuff. But, it's something that, when you're looking at your annual funding notice from the National Pension Fund, you should think about it and be like, this doesn't exactly tell the whole picture. Maybe you go on to pbgc.gov and you look at what the annuity rates are. And if you see that it's higher than 2.5, like, okay, that's more important than what my annual funding notice says. If I want to understand my withdrawal liability well, think about your interest rates. Sure.
So I'm an electrical contractor, and we have a local pension. So do our local trustees, can they change that funding rate to a lower amount if they chose to?
You can. So here's a double-edged sword, right? So I'm an employer that contributes to your electrical pension fund, and you are too. If you're going to stay in the fund and I'm going to leave, so I'm going to become your non-union competitor out there, you'd probably want to kick me in the pants as hard as you could on the way out. You'd want to hit me as hard as you could, right? So you might say, this Siegel blend is great. But can we do it twice? Because this obviously has the effect of overstating the withdrawal liability. Your actuary should use whatever method the trustees tell me. But
So going down the road, say you get 100% funded. I'm probably getting ahead of ourselves here. If you get 100% funded, is there some rule that says you have to make a bigger distribution? Or can you fund up to like 110%?
There's an excise tax that comes due, and there's a maximum deductible contribution. So you make contributions on behalf of your bargaining employees, you get a deduction for that. When the plan goes over like 120%, the plan gets assessed an excise tax, and the amount that you can deduct, you can't deduct the full nut anymore.
Because if you wanted to have a little fluff and say, we don't want to make a distribution, or we don't want to increase the distribution, but if we took the funding rate down, then we might have a little more cushion, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah. Yep.
Do you actually have to increase benefits at any point if you get 150, 160% funded?
Yep. Yeah. So if you're, there's only a couple building trades, like the roofers pension fund is one that's 100%. So what you do is you either reduce contribution rates or you increase accruals. You got two levers basically. So you could increase the accrual rate, and perhaps if you want to do so, you could do it retroactively too.
So that would be the way around that, by increasing that funding. One of those.
Yes.
Yeah. Is the local plan fully funded, President?
About 95% with the target of 100% very soon. And we just had a board of directors meeting yesterday talking about 7.5% and maybe going up to 63%. It's a good time for me to ask that question. We just talked about it last night.
Yeah. That's a really popular topic nowadays with 7.5. How realistic is that?
Yeah. We're not getting that.
No.
So, they make the projection, but we're not hitting it 7.5%.
So again, the investment pros will tell you 7.5% is not short term, it's long term, it's 50-year returns. But still, I think 7.5% is perhaps on the high end. And that 6 3/4, 7 1/4 is perhaps maybe more closer to reality. So that's a Siegel blend method. A couple kind of takeaways that I wanted you all to have. Interest rates, huge driver here, very important. There is for a plan that uses the Siegel blend method, there's zero correlation between your funded percentage or what your annual funding notice says and your withdrawal liability number. I'll illustrate that a little bit more in some examples. Where you have a long period of declining PBGC rates like we do now, where these numbers just keep going and going and going and going. The withdrawal liability, so think about this, the withdrawal liability is going up despite the plan being better funded. The plan's got more money. The plan's got less liabilities. So, it's very backwards. It doesn't make any sense. Again, this interest rates, this method, it really kind of, for somebody who spent a lot of time with this, I've kind of like come to grips with it, but I'm sure for some of you all that this just doesn't make any sense. Why doesn't we change this? Why doesn't Congress, or why isn't this, regulatory kind of, this is how this plan must do this? It's kind of a frustrating concept, but it was important. So those were the rates as of for the plan year ending 2015, and these were just kind of some recent ones, as of February 2017. Here we're down to 1.8, so that again pushes that number even higher. So I'll stop talking about interest rates here for a little bit, and maybe what we'll do is we'll talk about, great, so I was here just to learn about how what do I have to do to never have to pay that amount? That's the only thing I care about. I don't care about how I get it.
Yeah, now you have our attention.
Yeah, so I really don't want to get that bill. What do I do? I'm going to finally start listening. The general rule, the full termination of your participation in a multi-employer defined benefit plan will assess you, will get you withdrawal liability, or what's called a triggering event, for a substantial reduction in your contributions to the plan. We're going to kind of start going down a bit of a rabbit hole here in terms of some particular dynamics. We'll talk about building construction industry exemption. But in general, if you leave a pension fund, you can affect the withdrawal. If you reduce the amount that you contribute to that pension fund by 70% or more over a 3-year period, you can also affect the withdrawal.
Wait. So what you're telling me is, let's say you're a 50-man shop, and you're thinking about retiring or whatever, and you decide to shrink down your company so that you can easily manage it as you slowly get to that point. Over 3 years, they can nail you with a liability, underfunded liability.
Stay with me here for 1 second. Okay. So, next slide. So, building and construction industry exemption. So Congress, in their wisdom, Congress decided that the building and construction industry was unique, particularly for withdrawal liability purposes. There are, as you know, or as I know, I guess, the nature of the construction industry is different perhaps than like manufacturing. So if you're a widget manufacturer, you manufacture widgets every day, all day. And orders come in, you fill them. Construction is different. There are ebbs and flows. Sometimes it's busy, sometimes it's not. The building and construction industry exemption, basically, there is a partial withdrawal, but it just really, rarely, it only basically applies in some kind of complicated circumstances that I'm not even going to describe. But so, to your question, building and construction industry employer decides to slow down. He's going to reduce his contribution rate by like 70% or more. There's no partial withdrawal. But so how does a building and construction industry employer, or how does an employer qualify for this building and construction industry exemption? So the test is substantially all the employees with respect to whom you have an obligation to contribute and perform work in the building and construction industry. What is building and construction industry? That connotes job site work as opposed to factory or shop floor work. So if I'm on a job site wearing a construction hat doing, hanging duct, I'm doing building construction industry work. And if instead I'm standing next to a spiral machine, I'm not doing building construction industry work. Despite the fact that that spiral is going to go to a job site, that is not building construction industry work. National Pension Fund, again, sheet metal workers, National Pension Fund has their own test for this, has their own test to determine if you are considered building construction industry employer. 85% or more of your employees must spend 25% or more of their time in the field. How is that different? It's not a little bit, but basically, one day I may be running a spiral machine, and then say, for example, I started out as a Class 5 worker, and I learned to run a spiral machine. I go into the apprenticeship, and then all of a sudden I'm on job sites, for the rest of my career. This kind of looks to figure out how much of my time was spent in the field versus in the shop. It tries to be a little bit more of a precise measurement here, but that's kind of National Pension Fund's test, and we'll talk about kind of, if you want to figure out if you met that, how you could kind of run those numbers yourself. TAB, the testing balancing work, is considered building construction industry work, but obviously the fabrication, so if you do prefabs of whatever material, racks, anything like that, that's not building construction industry work, more is service work.
Wait. That's testing and balancing?
Yes.
That's what you're talking about?
Yes.
We don't do any of that.
Okay.
We don't prefab, we don't install. These guys do, we don't.
Right.
We
Don't
test.
complain.
Yeah,
We balance.
but it does qualify for the construction industry exemption,
It does.
but service doesn't? How does that make any sense?
So I'll,
So your exam from these triggering events. That's what that means.
It
You're
does.
exempt from the triggering events.
well, no, let me try this one first. So why does National Pension Fund treat TAB as building construction industry? The way it was explained to me is that TAB is ordinarily the work, and I know that this is a bit, you understand your business better than I do, but I understand that TAB is ordinarily work which is done upon, kind of when that building's getting closed up, upon completion of a job. So it is pretty much in line with
New construction?
construction, as opposed to service, which is
After the
replace a
fact.
belt, a filter. This building is 20 years old.
What if you're rebalancing a system?
I'm not going to
Okay. All right, sorry.
defend. Well, but that's kind of why that's the distinction and the reason for it.
So just a quick question. So if you were not planning to retire, but you're changing your business model, so you're moving away from fabricating or doing a bunch of work in the field and you're moving more toward modular construction, like putting together racks and pre-assembled stuff in the shop and growing your service business, you could potentially trigger with a partial withdrawal just based on changing your business model?
So I think what you would do is if you move from a guy who's doing a lot of job site work to someone who's doing none but was doing a lot of prefab work, you would no longer perhaps be considered a building construction industry employer. You then, if you had lost that kind of cloak of immunity there, if you then did one of those 70% dips over 3 years, you then, yes, could perhaps have a partial withdrawal.
Okay, just something to keep in mind.
So what does this mean if you're a building construction industry employer? It means you're only going to trigger withdrawal liability in essentially 2 ways. You decide to go non-union, or you decide to bargain out the obligation to contribute to the pension fund. So you're a building construction industry employer, and you decide to that the union marketplace isn't for you, and then you continue to perform work of the type for which contributions are required. That means if you then do the same sheet metal work non-union, you're going to get that withdrawal liability bill. If you decide that you don't want to bargain with the multi-employer group and you want to bargain on your own, and you want to tell the union, I'm not going to contribute to this pension fund anymore because it stinks, you then are going to get that same withdrawal liability bill. There are, obviously some important nuances in here, like with subcontracting. If I decide, I don't want to even self-perform whatever, mechanical work, sheet metal work, I want to get into the business of kind of CMing that. I want to sub it out. How does that work? We'll talk a little bit about that too. So in general, if you just, and again, so if you've got that same business where you're slowing it down and you decide, I'm just going to lock the door and I'm going to go retire down down the lake and take it easy for the rest of my life, if you just cease contributing to the pension fund, you haven't effected a withdrawal if you're a building construction industry employer. So you shut her down, so I'm done. Oh, that's not a withdrawal. as opposed to the guy who's got the fabrication shop. He shuts it down, he's getting the bill, because he has effected a withdrawal.
So Barry here decides he's going to retire.
Yeah.
And he says, oh, it's 2018, I'm retiring. He's paid all his bills, he locks the door, he sells the building. That's not a withdrawal. So he's not triggering anything and doesn't have to pay this liability.
That's right. So let's be careful of what does he do with all his assets. Does he sell his trucks, his tools, his customers, his key guys, then go and operate non-union? You know, because if I'm his key employee, I say, hey, thanks, Terry, I'm going to take that business you started. I'm going to run a non-union now. We might have a situation. But we'll talk about that. But to be, you know, very simple about it, yes, if he just closes it up, that's it. Nothing to worry about.
Is there a difference between an asset sale and a stock purchase?
There is. And we'll talk about that.
that.
Yeah, we will. So this is basically building construction industry exemption, and so how we help people figure out if they meet this test. And this is pretty rudimentary. It is a spreadsheet for Liam Sheetmetal, my little guy, his company, and this is how you might figure out if 85% or more of your employees spend 25% or more of their time in the field. Okay? So you would basically, or the way that we do this is, so we have an employer that says, hey, how do I know if I meet the building construction industry test? We say, all right, let's go through your employees, get all your bar unit guys, the employees on whose behalf you made contributions. Let's figure out what they did. How much of their hours were in the shop, how many of their hours were in the field. If you've got all your guys here in the field, you know, you're rock solid. If you've got all your guys in the shop, you got a problem. If you have that kind of blend, you have a mix, you do some prefab, you do some installation, you know, that's where you have to be that's when we take the close look. We rarely figure out, you do time card, you basically say, how close am I to this? And you just, you know, kind of figure out the level of depth you want to go into that.
How accurately do they track that?
It depends on exactly what you want to do. So are you, I mean, I guess the way National Pension Fund will do this is they might, so say for example, you have a blend of prefab and job site work, and you shut down your company. And they might say, well, are you building construction industry report or not? And the way you might kind of summarily kind of show them what you do is through this. And you might do it for 2015, 2014, 2013. You might do like a 5, 10, 15-year run of this. There's no real defined measurement period in which you're building construction employer or not.
But the litmus test is what their classification is, right?
Right. So
Fabrication versus.
Yeah.
Okay.
Some areas have like production rates and production agreements. I don't know if you guys have much of that. Or,
We have an industrial agreement,
okay.
but not many employers actually use it.
Yeah. So one way they could look at it is to say, all right, well, these are the guys on whose behalf you contributed at the industrial or production rates.
How else would they look at it?
Well, they'll you know, the way they can do it is basically take any kind of
Audit jobs or something?
essentially, yeah.
How far back can we go?
Well, I mean, that's the question here is today all I do is fabricate duct in the shop, and I decide I don't want to do that. And tomorrow I tell all my guys, go out and start hanging duct on a job site. So today I'm a building construction industry employer. Does that then mean that, like that, I changed my, I'm now a building construction employer, I have that kind of that cloak of immunity? It's not really well defined. I think that, you know, the advice that we would give you is you probably should look at 5 years and more in order to be kind of comfortable. You know, National Pension Fund will basically look at, have you had some kind of really systematic shift in the way that you do business one way or the other? Have you really gone into fabrication? Have you really gone into job site work? there's unfortunately not really a hard test. So, subcontracting. So let's take a look at, this is a provision in your guys' collective bargaining agreement. It says, in English, you can't subcontract job site work to a non-signatory, right? You all know that. If you subcontracted work to a non-union guy, you would have agreements coming your way the next day. Okay? This is another collective bargaining agreement, not yours. So this is another one. This is for a laborers union. It says, if you subcontract work and your sub fails to pay the fringes when they become due, that's your responsibility. Okay? So your agreement doesn't say that. Theirs does. That's important for withdrawal liability purposes. So, these two PBGC letters from the 80s. So they basically say this, if I am a sheet metal contractor, I'm signatory to the lawyer's agreement, this is what my subcontracting language says. And then I decide, I don't really want to get into the business of self-performing sheet metal work anymore. I'd really rather subcontract it. I think I've become like a mechanical, full MEP construction manager type. And that's the way I want to go. So I'm not going to sign a new agreement, and I'm going to fire all my employees all my sheet metal workers, plumbers, electricians, whatever. I'm going to lay all them off. All I'm going to do is subcontract work. Under this agreement, you didn't effect a withdrawal because you're not performing that work yourself, nor are you responsible for the debts of your subcontractor. Okay? If instead I was I was signatory to a laborer's collective bargaining agreement, and I decided, you know what, I'm going to become a general contractor. I'm tired of employing people. I'm just going to work with, run subs. If instead I had this language, the day I subcontract any of that work, non-union, the day I subcontract work for which contributions are not made to the pension fund, I'm going to owe withdrawal liability. Okay, so here I subcontract union, non-union, doesn't matter. I won't affect a withdrawal. This language, I subcontract non-union, I have a withdrawal. So that's subcontract. So we're going to talk a little bit about how we calculate and pay this. Again, this is a little bit of a kind of wonky concept, but I'll try and make it as simple and brief as possible. The way that this is done is pursuant to, Congress did actually prescribe some regulations here. So there is what's called the presumptive method, which is what building trade claims use. And this kind of explains the calculus. So basically, there's kind of what we sometimes will call like a rolling 5. So the way that you are allocated unfunded vested benefits each year based on what your share is of the total contributions made to the plan and the plan's underfunding. And I think this is actually easier if we showed an example. Next slide. So here's a bunch of years. This again is NPF data. And we'll show like a real life example of this. But you could even, so Sheet Metal Works National Pension Fund has, you can call them up and they will get you an estimate of your withdrawal liability in sometimes the same day, but usually no later than the next day. There's also a worksheet online that you can complete yourself. This is what it looks like. It's an Excel doc. You pop in some numbers. The important thing you need to know is what your contributions were. That's not always something that people readily have accessible. So essentially, the total plan contributions come in each year, okay? And then you put that against what your contributions were in the plan. this is a 5-year number. So this is this year's and the 4 preceding. So if we look at this, this is the sum of these 4. The same would be true for your employer contributions. And then what we do is we figure out what your slice of that pie is, how big of a contributor you were in that year. And then you get allocated this number. You get allocated your slice, your dirty dish of that number. You get your allocable share of that based on how much money you put in. Okay? So this is an example of Liam's sheet metal. What I used is, I assumed a 25-man crew. I assumed that his contribution rate for each of these years was for each plan year was the average contribution rate that NPF reported. And I assumed that it was each guy worked the average number of hours. So it's somewhere between, depending on the year, 2001 it could have been 1,500, and here it could have been 2,000. So there's a lot of assumptions. The purpose of this is kind of illustrate how you do this math. His numbers over here, so how much he's contributing into the plan versus how much the total plan contributions were. And then you'll see the liability that gets allocated. So again, this is a guy, this Liam guy, he starts a shop, he has, and I mean this, we don't have to bring out the tissues again, but he has paid all his benefits on time, he has done nothing wrong, he has 25 guys. His withdrawal liability is $537,000. So again, some math. For comparison purposes, push us forward one more. That was assuming a withdrawal in the 2015 plan year. In the 2014 plan year, his withdrawal was $485,000. So we climbed roughly $50,000 a year, which, again, if we go back to interest rates, these basic pools, this is again is that unfunded vested benefits, that again is that liability that is getting pumped up artificially through these interest rates. You'll see here, these things are going up a lot. There's some kind of reallocated pools and effective benefit pools, which is a bit of a, with an actuarial topic that gets a little confusing, but so when you think about how this is calculated, you're basically going to get assessed your slice of the pie. Each year there's going to be a pie cut, and you're going to get assessed your slice of that depending on how much you put in relative to how much other employers put into the fund. Again, I'm the bigger employer, I get more than Lori, who would be a smaller employer, she would get less. And obviously the 2014-2015 difference, 50 grand over a year for not doing anything besides watching PBGC rates go down.
Mike, you've got line B there, de minimis, $50,000. What does that refer to?
So there are these reductions that are available to employers who, this applies so infrequently, particularly with the National Pension Fund. So if your withdrawal liability were for some reason to be less than $50,000, it then gets kind of washed away. So if you're less than 50 grand, it gets washed away. When does that ever happen? If an employer signs a 3-year agreement, has 2 guys, and decides this doesn't work, this is not my thing, he then would likely qualify for that de minimis. Other pension funds that are funded, this sometimes applies more frequently. So you all may have heard there was this pension law that was passed on December 31st, 2014. One thing that it did do, which was pretty newsworthy, was that it allowed pension funds to cut benefits for prior service. So a pension fund can always reduce my accrual rate for my future service. So they'll say, all right, for 2018, the accrual rate, instead of being, $100 per every service credit, is going to be $50. They can always reduce future. Until this law, they couldn't reduce past. Okay, so they couldn't say, Mike, you earned these pension benefits before, but tough, we're going to cut them. They couldn't do that. This law said that they could. This law said that for plans which are called critical and declining, which means they're going to go insolvent within either 10 or 15 years, depending on the funding percentage. This means that they can reduce my prior service accrual. They can cut my pension. There are probably 30 or 40 plans nationwide that are in critical and declining status. In order to do this benefit cut, you have to submit an application to the Department of Treasury, and they have to approve it. There are about a dozen plans that have done so. All of them have been denied except one. The Iron Workers team, or Iron Workers fund out of Cleveland, was granted, or their application was approved. So that means that Iron Workers in Cleveland, their pension benefits are cut somewhere between 1/3 to 2/3, which is tragic for some people, but it was what's necessary, the pension fund said, and Treasury agreed, in order to avoid them going broke. They said, if we do this, we won't go broke.
Let's just read that yesterday. Article 17.
Yeah.
40 to 60% cut. They're already,
Yeah. For the purposes of our discussion today, withdrawal liability, one thing that the Multi-Employer Pension Reform Act did do relative to withdrawal liability, again, was a couple things. In determining your highest contribution rate, so you mentioned that you were paying
Thank you.
These surcharges or contribution increases under the FIP and the rehab plan for National Pension Fund. You were paying that 7% juice each year. So you think of that, you have your contribution rate, and then you have what's called that contribution increase or that surcharge or whatever. When you calculate your withdrawal liability, this part on top that's designed to improve the funding, that doesn't apply in either determining how much money you put into the plan, okay, or what your highest contribution rate was. So the way, and we'll talk about this, the way that you pay off your withdrawal liability is essentially you take what your average contribution hours were times your highest contribution rate, and then that kind of gives you what your annual payment is going to be, and it's quarterly. But that highest contribution rate does not include that kind of juice, the funding improvement contribution. Okay? MEPRA codified that or kind of put that into law because it was a bit of a highly litigated issue. There was a bunch of cases that have been going around on that issue with inconsistent results, and they finally kind of clarified that. The reason everybody cares, what this said is that, or what these courts had said is that your highest contribution rate pursuant to a collective bargaining agreement. So that would just be your base rate. The contribution rates which were on top, those FIP or rehab plan increases, those were kind of statutory contributions. Those weren't required in your collective bargaining agreement. That was the pension fund by statute coming in and telling you you owe 7% more each year for the next however long we tell you. So MEPRA, so that was an important thing to understand, not to kind of earth-shattering stuff. Obviously, the big thing that's out there with pension reform legislation is this effort to kind of get these kind of hybrid plans. This didn't do that. There's obviously still efforts ongoing at national levels to get that through. I don't know what the likelihood of that is. It seems like with Congressman Klein was kind of the chair of that committee that had really championed this pension reform legislation, and he then retired. I don't know what the likelihood of that is. I don't know if they talked about that last week.
It's not, I don't know how likely it is this session. There's no they haven't identified a vehicle to kind of attach it to at this point. So it's still kicking around, but I don't think it's anything that's going to happen in the next couple of years.
Okay. So then what we'll talk about on our next slide is how this number is paid. We talk about Liam's payment or his withdrawal liability number. He doesn't have to pay that in a lump sum, so he doesn't have to come up with 500 or 400 grand. But he does have to pay it, and it is paid back according to a formula which is described in the statute. It says that your payment, it's essentially intended to mirror when you contributed to the plan. So when you contributed to the plan, you contributed on average, say, $200,000 a year. You're going to essentially have to repay roughly 200 grand a year until your withdrawal liability paid off. There's some caveats to that, but it is basically your average annual number of contribution base units for your 3 highest years. So we'll show you an example here. Times your highest contribution rate during that 10-year look-back period. Again, as we said before, you don't include those kind of FIP or that rehab numbers on top. This thing, so sometimes there are employers, say for example, who have different contribution rates. So you said your industrial agreement. Your industrial agreement may say that you contribute at $2 an hour, but for your journeyman you contribute at $12 an hour. Your highest contribution rate, even though you may have had 50 guys under the industrial agreement, 1 under the the building trades agreement, your highest contribution rate is at $12 an hour, not the industrial rate. So this is, so just a couple other points too. There's a 20-year cap on your repayment. So as I said, it's intended to mirror what you paid in when you were a contributing employer. But at 20 years, it stops. You can't ever have to pay for more than 20 years. So if your average number, if you pay that off, and by 20 years you haven't paid up your whole liability, that's all you have to pay. That doesn't necessarily, it doesn't quite yet apply to sheet metal work national pension fund. For really severely underfunded plans, particularly central states, what happens is that sometimes you only have to pay off like half your liability, or even less, because your withdrawal is so huge, you can't pay that off in 20 years. You always can pay it off in a lump sum. How do you, basically if you want to, sometimes we work, with a client that says, all right, well, great, I have to pay that off over how long? 20 years. Okay, so what's the total of that stream? Discount it back. What can I buy an annuity at? Can the pension fund accept less than 100 cents of the dollar if I give them a check to them? Will they accept 50 or 75 cents of the dollar? The answer is sure. Sometimes they will. They'll take a little bit less. Not always. It's a bit of a negotiation. It's how likely does the pension fund think that you're going to be able to pay off that over 20 years? Perhaps there's some risk of you defaulting. They'd probably rather have the money now than risk it not coming through in the future. So this is Liam's withdrawal liability number. So you remember that his number was 535. So Liam's number was 537,000. And so what we do here is we look back at his contribution years. Okay. So we look at his hours. We basically figure out what the 3-year average was. We find the highest 3-year average. I hope you can see this a little bit in your print, and I realize it's not too easy to see here, but what we're showing here is your highest 3-year CBU period times your highest contribution rate, which is his last year. That times that gives you your annual payment. So Liam was contributing somewhere around $215,000 a year here. His annual payment is going to be close to that, $220,000. Annual, plans can require it monthly. Ordinarily, they do it quarterly. So that $220,000 then gets slashed into 4. He has 9 quarterly payments at that 55, and then a balloon of 40 at the end. So if if you go on and do your that worksheet on National Pension Fund, or you get your number, this is how you would figure out what your repayment obligation is going to be. And why is that important? Some people want to do the math and say, look, I think that if I don't have to contribute to a pension fund, I can be X more profitable. So is X greater than what your Y is going to be? It's kind of the simple math, essentially. I think what we'll do here is we'll kind of just talk about liability for this. Actually, maybe, is this a good time to stop, or how are you all feeling? Power through here for a few more? Okay. So, liability. So, you asked earlier, who is liable for this? So, obviously, if I withdraw and I'm the employer, I'm liable. The employer is liable. The corporation is liable. If I'm a member of a control group, so control group is a term under the Internal Revenue Code. There are 3 types of control groups. Think of it as though companies which share ownership, holding companies, companies which have interrelated owners. There's all sorts of attribution rules, complicated stuff going on, but essentially think of control groups as companies which are owned, have kind of common or joint ownership. If I'm the withdrawing employer and I don't have any money, I'm broke, I'm judgment proof, and Lori's company is in my control group, her company could be liable too. The way this sometimes gets a little tricky is, or some things to think about are like this. If you have, say for example, a company where you own, this company owns the land that your sheet metal business is located on, and that company perhaps also owns the building, and perhaps there's another company, or the same company owns the tool, the trucks, etc. If that, so the sheet metal company withdraws, it doesn't have any money, and say, for example, our purposes, it's not a building construction industry employer, so it is responsible for the withdrawal liability, or it goes non-union. That company that owns the land is going to be responsible too. So sometimes people get these kind of ideas or some advice that, well, here's the scheme. You put the company in, you put the land in another company, put the tools in another company. So essentially when it comes due, they can't collect because the sheet metal business doesn't make money. And these things are not the same business. It doesn't work because it's a control group. You can try and put it in your kid's name, your wife's name, your dog's name, all that. Pension funds have litigated all this stuff, and I think people sometimes continue to get the advice that, well, you should rent the building from yourself, and then what happens is if you own that individually, if you own that personally, and that employer withdrawal, the employer withdrawal can't pay it, you personally are then going to get sent that bill. Because you're a trader business, if you're renting that building personally. So sometimes, kind of these schemes to kind of set up these kind of cards and move them around, and it doesn't always work because the pension fund will find a way to kind of connect who's got money, who's in that control group. And this won't come as any surprise to you, but the law really kind of favors pension funds. They have really good records in court. So personal liability, trades or businesses under common control. Trades or business generally limit personal liability. As I said, if you own property or equipment and do business with that employer, that contributing employer, you may now become a trade or business. So again, that kind of advice that your buddy's attorney gave you, put the tools in your name and then lease them to the company, and you can get that kind of revenue stream there, and then you won't be liable. It's a bad idea.
Mike?
Sure.
With that, what you just said there, it's on the, let's say you're not in the business of trying to scheme things off, but let's say somebody else actually owns the land or the building that you're leasing or whatever, and, you decide you're gonna, get yourself in a triggered liability underfunding thing. How is that person guilty, or how are they responsible? That kind of doesn't make sense. They're the innocent party.
I don't think
Yeah.
he's saying that. He's saying that if I take
you're
my
part of a business and
building,
you
if
do
I
that.
take my building and I put it into her name, they're still gonna come after her.
You're connected.
Right.
It has to be somebody in the control group.
If Harry here owns my building and I rent his place from him, then Harry's not gonna be liable, right?
Right.
Your landlord can breathe easy now, Henry.
The final thing we'll touch on in this kind of liability portion, and then what we'll do is we'll take a time out, and then we will talk about kind of transfers of ownership, acquisition, mergers, sales, all that good stuff, succession planning. The final thing, if you push us forward a little more, successor liability. So we talked a little bit about, well, say, I just want to kind of get out of this. I just want to sell my stuff off. How does that work? As I said before, the rule is and the law is that if I'm a building construction industry employer and I stop, take the keys, head out to the lake for the rest of my life, I'm good. No withdrawal liability is assessed. There's not a triggering event. If instead I take those tools, in this case, Man Web Services, this was a electrical contractor out of Chicago. He had was a contributing employer to a pension fund, and decided, this is not, I'm not in this for life. I'm going to hang up and go find something better to do myself. Sells all his tools to this Man Web Services company. Basically says, here's my trucks, my tools, the wire cutters, all that stuff. This Man Web Services is not a contributing employer. The predecessor entity essentially went out of business, so Man Web Services, being an entrepreneurial kind of guy, said, hey, I know that your former service company went out, and I'd like to get your business. So he basically took over all his customers too. This guy got stuck with his predecessor, the guy who sold him all the tool liability. So they look at basically, is there a notice of liability? So did this guy know, or should he have known, that there was a withdrawal liability? And was there a substantial continuity in the operation of the business before and after the sale? What does substantial continuity mean? Same tools, same employees, same equipment, same place of business, same customers, key personnel. This guy's even worse. This guy was, the name of the company was, the name of the company that preceded this was, let's call it like Tim's Floor Covering. So there's this guy named Tim, and he has a floor covering business. It's in San Francisco. Tim runs a business out of 1 Broad Street and installs flooring. Union flooring guy. He's got a key guy who works for him. His name is Michael. Tim gets older. Tim decides, you know what? I've kind of had it. I'm gonna close it down. He takes all the equipment, takes it to an auction house. Michael, having worked in this business for a long time, knows the customers, knows how the business works. What he does is he takes over that lease at 1 Broad Street, changes the name. Instead of Tim's Floor Covering, it's now Michael's Floor Covering. Goes to that auction house, buys all the equipment, says, I don't want to be a union contractor anymore. That's a bad idea. We got all this unfunded liability. It sucks. He is the successor. He gets tagged because there's notice of liability and substantial continuity in the operation of the business before and after the sale. And when you think about that, this guy just went to an auction house, bought some tools, took over a lease. He continued to take those same customers on, but customers also chose him too. So there's a lot of inequity there. But the important part to be really kind of have your ears up on is this: is it isn't so much applied to you all, but so if you're going to sell your business perhaps, and that guy thinks that he's going to kind of take the tools, equipment, customer lists, and operate it non-union and avoid the withdrawal liability, perhaps he will, but there's a really good, this litigation trends, the risk is that, pension funds do everything they can to get kind of dollars in the door, and that means chasing every lead they can. That means that guys like Michael are going to get chased. And in this case, so there was, so the way this works, the purpose of this case was to kind of illustrate to you all this. So there was a company called SMACCA Construction LLC. It basically decided that it could no longer compete, and this is in Utah, it could no longer compete against non-union contractors. It had a collective bargaining agreement that required it to make contributions to this pension trust, and it decided to basically get out of it. Its collective bargaining agreement expired. Approximately six months after its collective bargaining agreement expired, and so what it did is basically it decided that it's going to withdraw from the pension fund, but it's not going to affect the withdrawal. So it was going to do that kind of subcontracting work. It was basically going to be a general contractor, it was going to subcontract work, but it was going to subcontract it all to union contractors. It was just going to kind of make its money on 3%. It would, kind of put on top of their numbers. It was part of a holding company or a control group. The control group bought another company called CFA. CFA was a non-union company. It also worked no contributions. This, even though SMACCA was not performing the work, the control group was performing work of the type for which contributions were required, so a withdrawal trigger. So successor liability and control group liability, the importance of understanding it's not just the single contributing employer, it's all employers on the control group. What are they doing?
So again, if he wouldn't have, if the controller would have started the non-union group, it just would have set that record.
Right.
But they wouldn't have.
You would have been fine, but when they made that acquisition of that non-union arm, they didn't quite think that that pension fund was going to chase them too. So successor liability, I think you guys any questions, and then maybe what we'll do is we'll take a break and we'll pick up on sales acquisition. Questions?
Okay, let's take 5 minutes then. Thanks, everybody. You good? Do you need anything?
Yeah, exactly.
We don't get maybe twice.
This is only one HVAC metric. Yeah, in his example, just 25 people, one year the increase was about $39, $75,000 if everybody just contributed that $1 more, this thing is no way out.
It was free. It was clear enough. That's what they kind of
Yeah. Right, exactly. So you got in on that.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, man. Was your idea to have a tissue moment?
Yeah.
Is there gonna be a tissue moment?
We're gonna show all of you what you got.
So where would I look to find out about this job exemption?
I don't know that you'd look anywhere, but we represent cab contractors and national pension funds that their building construction is required in ours.
Yeah. So I don't have to worry about this then?
Again, if your point is to take your business and then stop when the time is right for you, yeah.
Okay, so say I sell it to my kid or something, right?
Right.
Yeah, right,
So he inherits this quote-unquote liability,
He does.
and then he decides, well, this isn't what I want to do, and stops, and goes and does, I don't know, he wants to go flyboarding or
Sure.
run jet skis or some other thing, right?
Right.
Is he held liable? Would he,
There you go.
Thanks, Mike.
Michael, what
That's
year-
$30 I ever spent.
What year did
So that
they
one here.
exempt construction in your building? Do you know what year that happened?
ERC.
1982.
Cool. Even two?
Right.
Okay. Well, everything was so big, we weren't sure if we were in that.
We may have come back and they said, we threatened once, we're having some problems with the local and we threatened once. We're just gonna get out of the unions. And they sent us a letter saying, oh, you can get out if you want, this is your liability.
I don't think they knew that we were balancers.
Well, I mean, let's be clear here. By get out, if you mean then go operate non-union.
Yeah, right. If I get out and go like non-union or something, then I'm liable, right?
Correct.
Okay.
But
If
if you
you-
just flat out retire and shut the business down, we have no withdrawal liability.
That's right.
I'm retired.
So angry, and now you're happy. You just won the lottery.
I'm retired.
That's $30 I ever spent.
So the feds are only allowing you to fix your program if you're in a critical downfall.
No, you can always.
Well, in the 14th, that act,
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Then you have to.
but can a plan say, I know we're in electrical on it, we're in the green, I think we're 90-some% funded.
Right.
Can we tweak the contributions back a little and up the input so it's closer to 100%?
Sure. So could you reduce the accruals?
Right.
in order to kind of set
forward-looking thing.
not prior to
But we have to agree, and it would have to be the union and everybody else agree to that. Whoever sits on the board, you know, to me, that makes sense to make small changes now, so the thing is gonna be around you 30, 40 years. Our biggest problem is losing market share. That's gonna be huge. Eventually it's gotta fail. I don't know that there's a pension out there that isn't gonna fail. Eventually.
Yeah, the challenge is find this kid, you gotta dollars from it, and get that contribution out and start to slide down. Market share loss.
They had talked 30 years ago, 30 people were putting in for one taken out. Now it's almost opposite. It's gonna fail.
Sure.
How long?
Yeah.
I'll be dead, but.
Do you want the list?
Okay. Is everyone,
If
all
you
the
want to.
captives back in? Okay, you guys ready to resume? Any questions from the last segment? All right.
So kind of the final piece of this that we're going to talk about here is, you know, how do you buy a business? How do you sell a business? How do you kind of transfer that to the next generation? And how do you do that with all this kind of withdrawal liability that's in the back of your head? And so this is kind of an area that we do a lot of, or I do a lot of work in, is kind of working with employers that are going to, you know, kind of big aggregators that are going to buy people and figure out how to do it, and they don't want to take on all their liability, or families that want to kind of pass on to the next generation, or the key employee who, you know, who's worked and earned his right to buy in on the business. A couple of kind of general rules. A sale of stock. So we talk about sale of stock versus sale of assets. Okay. Sale of stock is not by itself a triggering event, assuming that that company continues to contribute to the fund. So I'm 100% shareholder in a company, and you know what? I decide I'm going to hand the keys over to Lori, and she's going to run the business. We're going to do a stock sale. I'm not going to pretend to be an accountant and talk to you all about what the tax consequences are, but we're going to do a stock sale. She's going to take over my business. She's now the 100% shareholder. There's no triggering event. A couple exceptions. So if I'm going to instead sell my stock to this shell company over here that has no money, but is going to become the owner of my business, which is effectively going to shut down and withdraw from the pension fund, that shell company over there is now the stockholder, but it's a sale of stock, so it's not technically a triggering withdrawal event. This is what's called a transaction with the purposes to evade or avoid withdrawal liability. So again, this advice that some folks get of, you know, set up this kind of convoluted scheme where you sell it to this shell company and then this company keeps on, but that one doesn't. It doesn't work. You get some accountants who try and come up with some really creative stuff that ultimately all that ends up doing is, you know, it backfires and it ends up in a lot of litigation. So sale of stock, in general, not a triggering event. So a sale of assets. A sale of assets has kind of two different components, or rather two kind of where it can differ, depending on whether or not you meet that building construction industry test or not. So again, we talk about building construction industry employers, substantially all the employees on whose behalf you contribute from job site work. So think about our fabricating employer. All he does is prefab duct versus our guy who all he does is install duct. This guy, if he sells his assets, the fabricator, that's a triggering event. So he decides he's going to sell off the spiral machine, the building, all the material that he has, that's a triggering event. Sale of assets triggering. Alternatively, building construction industry employer. This guy, all I do is do job site work. All I do is hang duct. That's all I do. Job site construction work. No prefab at all. I decide I'm going to sell off all my tools. I'm going to throw it at an auction. I'm going to sell it. That is not a triggering event. Remember, though, we talked about that successor liability case, so this is that kind of dichotomy. So if I take those tools and I sell them to my trustee key employee who decides he's going to run this shop non-union from now on, then we kind of have what's called a successor liability. But sale of assets, triggering, not triggering. The way you kind of, if you are then looking at this and you're saying to yourself, well, geez, what if I'm not sure? I've kind of done that math, and I think I'm a building construction employer. Depends on how far you look back. I'm a little bit unsure. I don't really want to face a risk here. There's what's called the Section 4204. So if you flip to the next slide, Section 4204 is this point in, or this section rather, in MEPA. So what it says is that a sale of assets will not be a triggering event. So again, I'm a fabricator of duct, and I'm going to sell, I'm a fabricator of pipe, whatever. I'm not a building construction employer. I'm going to sell all my assets. If you structure the sale to comply with this section, meaning you go through all the requirements that we'll talk about here, it will not be a triggering event. And instead of your purchaser inheriting, so your withdrawal liability, again, is calculated based off of a 20-year contribution history. So if I sold my assets to Lori, she would inherit my liability, which is, again, 20 years worth of contributions. So using that Liam sheet metal example, she's going to inherit $537 of withdrawal liability like that. She didn't even do anything, but now she owns a lot of money. If instead I say, Lori, I'm going to sell you my assets, and we structure to comply with that 4204, she inherits a quarter of that liability. So her contribution base unit history that she inherits is 1/4 of that, 537, whatever that number is. It also eliminates this risk of successor claims. So, like for example, we recently represented a purchaser, a guy who was purchasing a sheet metal shop, and it was a little sketchy as to exactly how much fabrication they did versus how much job site work they did, and we could never get a good handle on it. And the records weren't all that awesome, and there was a lot of risk there of, man, if you are buying the assets of a non-building construction employer, that's going to be a triggering event. And then you're going to kind of take on that liability. You don't want to take on a 20-year contribution history, nor do you want to get sideways with the pension fund if they try and collect, and guess what, this guy hasn't been paying his taxes, so you're not going to pay the pension fund. Guess who they're going to come calling for, or client to fire. So this 4204 thing eliminates that risk of a successor claim. So basically you get the pension fund on the phone. I'm being really short with this, but the way it works is basically you work together with the pension fund to kind of get them on board, and you work very closely with their attorney, and it takes way longer than it should. But you basically inform the plan of your intent to comply with this 4204. You basically say that it's a sale to an unrelated party. Unrelated party is a term defined in like section 362D of the Internal Revenue Code. Unrelated party means essentially not your children, not your wife, none of that. So you can't use section 4204 to sell your business to your son, because you don't want him to inherit the whole liability.
What about a key employee who's not related to you?
That's fine. That's not considered a related party. The purchaser under this purchase agreement agrees to continue to contribute to the plan in substantially the same amount. So you basically can't sell it to somebody who's going to, sure, I'll contribute. I'll employ, instead of you employed 20 sheet metal workers, I'm going to employ 1. You have to employ substantially the same number of contribution base units. And then we have this bonding requirement. So the purchaser, essentially the pension fund is saying, all right, so we will not assess you withdrawal liability in exchange for two things. That this buyer is going to continue to contribute to our plan, and you, purchaser, are going to give us a bond in the event that you go belly up and we don't get those continued contributions. There are certain exceptions that apply. In the case of the Sheet Metal Workers National Pension Fund, they almost always apply because the numbers are so gigantic. You have to be selling a really, really, really huge company to not get this bond waived. The seller then remains secondarily liable. So if this, we say the purchaser will continue to contribute to the plan, and for some reason he can't quite manage the business really well, he goes belly up, he withdraws, or goes out of business, is triggered withdrawal liability, can't pay it, they're then going to come after the seller for, if in that 5-year window that occurs, you're secondarily liable. Okay, so again, so I sell my business to Lori. Lori agrees to continue to remain signatory to Sheet Metal Workers and pay contributions to the fund. She also, if she doesn't meet the de minimis test, but let's assume she will, she won't have to post a bond, but I'm going to be responsible for 5 years if she fails, and again, non-building construction industry, if she fails, doesn't pay, they're going to come after me. I also sometimes will have to post a bond or throw some money in escrow, some amount that we in the pension fund negotiate. These bonds are like a little bit, bonding companies like to make a lot of money, so these bonds are oftentimes prohibitively expensive. So essentially what they do in a lot of these cases is you'll put an amount, say for example maybe 10% of the withdrawal liability amount in an escrow account that the pension fund holds and gets the right to the interest on. Other times too, you can basically just say, we've had certain circumstances where, look, the seller can't provide a bond because the seller is broke. The seller's got the IRS knock on the door, and we're going to buy this company. The purchaser is going to buy this company. The purchaser is a really financially strong company, huge earnings, revenues, good balance sheets. The pension fund will say, okay, we got you. We're excited to have you contributing to the plan. Thank you for continuing to do that for us.
So is there a period of time for which the purchaser has to continue to contribute substantially the same amount to the plan? Or, can they eventually kind of run a smaller operation?
Yeah, we have that.
You'll get to that?
I'm not sure. Actually, I don't think that's on the slide. But essentially, it is. It's just an amount. It's just an obligation to contribute. If they then don't, withdrawal liability gets triggered, and if the purchaser is still around and has that, the means to pay that, they don't get assessed it. And if they don't, the seller is going to get assessed it for 5 years, if there's that 5-year period. So no, there's not like an amount you need to do so for X years.
So, well, let's say it's 10 years down the road and you bought a business that was at one time employed 20 sheet metal workers and all the 5-year stuff has expired. Can you go down to, say, 3 sheet metal workers without having to, without triggering any kind of withdrawal liability?
That's a good question.
Often those are melded right into a bigger group of sheet metal workers.
Yeah.
That's true.
So it's really hard to segregate them.
Okay.
Right.
Okay. Just wondering.
This is always like in an asset purchase agreement, you see this line. And there's not exactly like firm, I don't know that I've actually ever seen any kind of litigations or disputes over that.
Okay.
I got a question for you. So then, say, you need all the requirements, asset purchase. And then every year, once the new numbers come out on where you're funded, does that get kind of reset then? So if they had to determine your unfunded liability for 2 years from now, say, and the company is in your role, and therefore it's back to the seller, do they then look at where the plan is at today on the unfunded liability? Like in our instance, we're heading toward that 100%.
Yeah, so the liability that could attach to the seller would be the amount had there been a withdrawal at the time of the sale.
Oh,
So as of the day of the sale, not
to each other.
No, right. So you neither get hit for decreases in the fund's health, nor do you benefit from any improvements.
I guess I thought that once it was 100% funded, it kind of gets reset.
There is, they can do what's called like, I don't know if the term reset, but the actuaries can kind of reset the, or the pools are kind of let down.
Yeah.
Yeah, so when you hit 100%, yeah.
So if that was the case,
Yeah.
that would apply.
Correct.
2 years. Yeah, 2 years.
So the seller puts that, make sure that line is in there just to protect themselves, that they'll contribute substantially, and buy it over, contribute substantially
Yes.
as part of the ESA agreement.
How does it work if two companies say merge? Is that it's still the same, or is that work? It's not an employee, it's one company, both union?
Yeah, essentially if your contribution-based unit history was 100, and this one's, and mine was 100, we merged, now it's 200. So if our withdrawal liability was 537, yours was 537, now it's 1,074,000. Essentially you kind of aggregate the two. So this is some of the criteria again for the purchaser's bond. This is kind of more kind of informational. If there are certain circumstances in which the bond for a purchaser, again, think about that purchaser. The plan is saying, all right, are you going to have enough? Are you strong enough financially to continue to contribute to the plan? Because if you're not, we need a bond to protect us. Because we aren't going to assess withdrawal liability. We need to know that the money's going to keep coming in. So there are instances in which you can get a waiver for what's called a de minimis transaction. And that is basically where the amount of the bond, and again, the bond is the bond essentially looks at what your average annual contributions is in the 3 years preceding the sale. And so the pension funds, the thing about this, the pension funding is attempting to get some sort of security that if you go belly up, will be protected. And then what they'll do is they'll say, all right, well, so if this transaction is small enough that we don't have to, you don't pose such a risk to the plan, we'll waive it. What we call a de minimis transaction. For National Pension Fund, so there are two tests for whether you can get out of it. So if the amount of the bond does not exceed the lesser of 250 or 2% of the average annual total contributions for the three-part plan year. So the average contributions for NPF, $361 million, 2% of that. So then you look at what's does not exceed the lesser of, so 250. If you're an employer that contributes 250 a year or more, I mean, I don't mean to overstate this, but this is bigger companies obviously with larger workforces and higher contribution rates. If your bond is 250, you're going to have to post it, otherwise it's going to be below. So think about the size of your company, what's your average annual contribution to NPF, would you have bonding requirement? No. Also a couple other instances in which you can get your bonds waived. Seller's liquidation bond, again, this is had the withdrawal liability had been assessed at the time the sale was done, but for 4204, what would have been the liability? And then so you then have to post a bond in that amount. Again, think about my example of the guy who's selling his company because he's, the IRS is chasing him and he doesn't have any money. Our seller in that case didn't there was, the IRS was lucky to get any of it. The pension fund sure was a bond. So what we then had to do was to kind of go to the pension fund and say, hey, look, let us show you the books of this purchaser to demonstrate to you that this purchaser has the capacity, financial strength to continue, the integrity to kind of continue to contribute to the pension fund. You don't face any risks. And the pension fund said, yeah, you're right. We will waive the bond. So that's a seller liquidation bond. So these, again, so what we're talking about here is these 4204 concepts, and we're talking about a non-building construction industry employer. When would a building construction industry employer ever use this? So, again, there's technically not a withdrawal in connection with the sale of assets. But sometimes you want to, kind of avoid, you want to eliminate some risk. You don't want any uncertainty. And also, say I'm a key employee of this company, not related, and I don't really want to take on your 20-year history. I'd probably like to start out with a little less, if I could, just to mitigate it. And there's not really any cost to me to do that. So if I can start out, instead of having $537,000 from day one, Lori might say, I'd like to cut that down. Is there a way to do that? And yeah, you can structure it to comply with this. And the liability that she would assume would be 1/4 of that. So that's, kind of eliminating uncertainty of successful liability stuff, and kind of cutting down the liability that you're kind of assuming, or two reasons, contractors, building construction industry companies would use this liability.
Do we still need the bond and everything with that? At that point, when you structure it that way?
Yeah.
You still want the bond and everything to go along with it? Just...
Yeah. It's very fact specific, but a lot of the times the bonding stuff doesn't apply. It's kind of complicated but if you kind of run some of the numbers on your own, you look at your own contribution history, you might find that, okay, we're small enough that this isn't even required.
So Lori, as a buyer of this business, took on $150-some-odd thousand of liability that she bought it from Williams, I think, right? Her liability ceases at the end of 5 years. Her liabilities for Williams, if she continues to run the business, substantially the same contribution levels.
Right.
Her purchaser liability expires after 5 years, am I understanding that correct?
So,
or she just assumes 1/5 of that.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
So she'll
20% of that.
Right. So.
Sorry. Thank you very much.
Jim.
Very good.
So she'll so day one, so she starts contributing to the pension fund guide. She's going to grow her liability on her own.
Right.
So think about that. This is on the side here. She's going to continue to grow her liability on her own. Your withdrawal liability is based on 20 years. So at year 15, she's got her own 15 years plus the 5 on top. At year 16, 1 year falls off. 17, 18, 19, 20. So, kind of some closing thoughts here. Should we kind of talk about how you think about this in a sale? The question that I get asked a lot is, well, how do I sell this to my kid? My children, my son is in the business, or my key employees in the business. How do I do this? Do they want to run this business non-union? Is this good for them? What does the future look like? Is this non-union market share going to kind of fall over here? I think it's very fact specific. I think it's very much dependent on geographic location. If you were in Mexico or something like that, where their non-union market is 95%, it's a very different answer than perhaps here. So kind of with all that, I think this is a complex issue. It's important. I thank you all for taking the time to kind of spend a little time learning something about it.
Bless you.
It's not something that's really well understood. I think it's like this kind of big, scary issue. It's like my mortgage. It's like, oh my God, how am I going to pay this? I don't understand it. take a little time to understand. I don't know that it makes them any better, but I think with a little bit of education, perhaps, I think at least you all today understood that, okay, so I can shut down this building construction industry company. So, a little education I think can help. The litigation trends here are a little uncertain. That means that if you're going to sell your business, if you're going to buy the parts off of a business, be careful, because you don't know exactly what, how this case law is going to develop. 4204, again, is this way of structuring the sales that we think kind of immunizes everyone involved and eliminates a lot of risk. And again, I come back to the one that, the way you see these things end up in court or go sideways is when it's, like your buddy's divorce attorney who helped you draft the asset purchase agreement, or the accounting firm who thought they could teach you this new scheme. I'm not here to tell you that there's some sort of magic. Set up a holding company and lease the tools from here to there. I've seen a lot of those schemes, and I've heard people, well, this lawyer told me to do this, this will work, right? I don't think so, and I'd love to be the pension fund that's going to go after that. I think avoiding those negative surprises is the kind of thing that you aim to do with this when you're trying to figure out how to sell the business, pass it on to the next generation, buy your competitor. Kind of thinking through that with, being careful, because the dollars associated with this, as we've kind of seen, are not small. So with that, I hope that there are some questions or some comments.
A quick question. Say I run a 20-man shop. We're, winding down, get down to maybe 5 guys, and I decide to sell my assets to another company. Someone wants, I'm putting it out of business, send the guys to the hall. That company buys my assets and then possibly picks up some of those guys from the hall. Would that trigger a, if say maybe he picks up a few of those guys and they continue doing work on those particular customers that I had in business?
So it's not going to be a withdrawal if they're going to continue to work the union. If perhaps they were going.
Yeah. Okay. Would the liability that I had accumulated, would that transfer then to that company?
If the pension fund wanted it, if the pension fund wanted to say there's substantial continuity. So how kind of interrelated is this? Is it that your top 3 guys then went and took your company and added a...
No. He took all his stuff, right?
Yeah.
He sold it to Harry.
Yes.
Put all his guys into the union, back to the hall, said, okay, I'm done with you guys.
Uh-huh.
Harry calls up the union and says, hey, I need 4 guys. Same guys that worked for him come back and work for Harry now.
Yeah.
Is he held liable?
No. If he's going to continue to contribute,
Right.
no withdrawal.
So nobody's really held liable, right?
No. Again, and the reason is this, is that the pension fund, or the law rather, assumes that, those guys who he inherited, he had a slice of the pie that was allocable basically to cover the vested benefits of his guys. And he's going to continue to contribute.
But if his guys go down to the union, one of them says, hey, I'm going to start my own company, you guys come with me.
Yeah.
Then there's some liability.
I don't know that there doesn't sound like there's going to be a triggering event unless they go non-union. Are they perhaps going to inherit the liability? It's going to depend on how substantial, what the continuity is.
Is it a possibility they wouldn't inherit all the liability?
It's usually as
The
zero or
pension
nothing.
plan would look at, well, you picked up some of this practice from this company, a small percentage of it, maybe a small percentage of that company's liability would transfer?
So it's usually a zero or nothing kind of game. I think, though, that in most circumstances, the pension fund is not going to ding guys who go out and start their own company, so long as they're doing it union.
Tim, we can negotiate those details on
I think the question was, what happens to that slice of pie?
It gets whacked up amongst the rest of you, right?
The other key takeaway would be is if you're selling a business, talking to somebody who really understands this. Because there's lots of downstream issues that still come back and bite you.
Right. ESOPs too, is anybody here in ESOP? So, you know, that is always a challenging conversation when you explain to all the owners of the company that, right, the company has this 7-figure bill out there. It's not really a bill, but it is out there, it's a liability. And how does that, you know, if you're an ESOP and you basically are just going to acquire the stock of others, you know, you can't take advantage of the 4204. So you're inheriting 20 years. But that's just, you know, one of the realities of an ESOP.
So is it different buying like the receivables and the stock when it comes to the withdrawal liability?
Buying the
The
receivables?
receivables of the company or the stock?
Yeah. Yep.
Which one is better?
Yeah. Talk to your accountant. But, questions?
I'm a mechanical contractor in Janesville. Been in business for 25 years. I want to get out, I want to retire. Kids have no desire whatsoever in getting in after they've seen what I've been through. Sure. I want to get rid of everything, the business, the property, all the tools, everything. I'm assuming I should have a good lawyer for this. I'm sure there's lawyers that specialize in buying and selling companies.
And brokers too, yeah.
So what's my best bet? Just go through the phone book and start calling law firms?
Well, I'd be happy to know. I mean, yeah,
If you're a little closer, yeah.
Yeah, there are certainly people who, you know, yeah, do this kind of work. And be happy to, you know, help you or connect you with somebody around here who I know. There are then brokers of businesses who sell this stuff to other companies. You know, and there are always people, I should say, there are, you know, more, there are more people looking to buy into businesses nowadays than you'd expect. So brokers are kind of facilitate that transaction, and then they make their money on the sale price.
I mean, the brokers are around Janesville, so it's supposed to find
Perhaps, I mean, there's some nationwide firms that basically specialize in this type of work. And then there's always the, you know, kind of big aggregators that, you know, are looking to pick up companies. And sometimes there are even, you know, private equity money that looks to come in and kind of do the same type of thing.
I might have a name of a broker up north too. I don't know how close that would be.
What happens if your withdrawal liability is more than what your company is worth?
Talk to every employer who contributes to Central States. Every employer who contributes to Central States, or basically all of them, their withdrawal liability is more than
Right.
it. So
So do you just,
So like we, for example, we work with a, they're a very different crowd than you all. It's a chamber orchestra, okay? So they contribute to what's called the American Federation of Musicians Pension Fund. This thing is terribly underfunded, worse than yours, worse than cheaper. And obviously this, this thing is supported by really rich people who like to give away or have to give away money for tax purposes and people who buy tickets. So it doesn't really generate income. It's not for profit. Its withdrawal liability far exceeds any sort of measure of EBITDA or, you know, any of that stuff. It could claim bankruptcy if it wanted to kind of just discharge that debt and perhaps at the same time discharge its collective bargaining agreement. It could also just kind of keep on keeping on, and it's never going to incur the liability unless it decides to go non-union. But it'll essentially just keep compounding, and perhaps one day the pension fund will go insolvent and its musicians will perhaps lose some of their benefits.
overall, when you're talking about a couple of different pension funds, are there any that are worse off? I mean, you get this example, the Central States, and then you talk about the international for mechanicals. Are there any that are like ready to die now kind of things, or?
Oh yeah.
Are you not
Did you talk about the iron workers in Cleveland?
Yeah, there are.
If they didn't have that cut,
They would be done.
they would be done.
And then the Teamsters might hit hard too, didn't they?
Central States. Central States has basically got 3 actives, or 3 inactives, 3 retirees for one active. So think about that 3 to 1, that kind of Ponzi scheme idea. Yeah, the mine workers pension fund is terrible. There are some local sheet metal funds that are in pretty bad shape too, in some kind of depressed areas of the country, like Flint, who have had some really challenging economic times.
So where does the pension guarantee fund go?
So if the pension fund fails, so meaning if it is unable to pay debts when they become due, what happens is the PBGC basically takes over, becomes like the trustee of the fund. The guaranteed benefit on that is $30.50 a month, $30.50 times your years of service. The $30.50 times, say for example, a guy's got 30 years in. The maximum benefit he can get is around $12 grand a year, which is it's not much. And Central States, the liability that Central States would throw on PBGC when it fails in the next 6 to 7 years would take out every bit of money that Central State or that PBGC has. So there are a couple funds that have been taken over by PBGC, but small, very kind of not the kind of systemic risk that Central States poses.
So given that, what's the forecast for multi-pension plans? I mean, is there a big move afoot? I mean, is this why we're having this kind of meeting? What's going on? I mean, what's going to happen?
I kind of like offer my editorial here, and this is just my opinion. It doesn't speak for anyone else. It's a really challenging, defined benefit pension plans are very challenging, particularly in this union market where we don't have, our market shares aren't expanding, they're contracting, so contribution hours are going down, so we're having to fund legacy costs. We have very bad, recession that we're still kind of coming out of, both in terms of man hours and in terms of investment return. A lot of local areas are trying to negotiate in that supplemental retirement plan or a 401k so that they have to stop depending on that defined benefit to, so you talk to the membership, hey guys, look, this thing is not going to, it's not this year.
Might not be around, so
So
let's throw in this 401k. You guys can, put in $6 an hour.
Right.
Yeah, they just went to that a couple of years ago.
No, yeah, forever, but it doesn't.
Nobody ever wanted to get into it because the pension was so good.
Everybody.
And then you start the killing.
And you hear the, so think about the guys who are like the retirees of the Central States, these guys, for years and years and years and years, I'm not, carrying their water for them, but these guys for years and years and years took, didn't take wage increases. Perhaps they even took, they had cuts in wages in order to put more money into the pension because the pension told them, this is going to be here for life. This is what you're going to retire on. And now they're being told it's not going to be there. It kind of pulls at your heartstrings too for guys who are, say, disabled. Or, the guy's 70 years old, he drove a truck his whole life, he can't go out there. What's he going to do? Work at Walmart for $6 an hour? So, there's obviously some stuff going on in Congress where they're attempting to kind of establish some sort of, the PBGC, give the PBGC the ability to kind of issue government-backed debt. I'm going to use the word a bailout of these pension funds, which is what it is, but that's kind of what people are trying to do. Basically, get some money, issue some bonds to bail out these pension funds and kind of protect these people.
Is there any talk of just making them go away, like from Congress, saying that, okay, these don't work, they're not the greatest thing. I get we have what we have going on, but let's ones that are funded or anything like that, moving them over to different programs that aren't so, volatile and risky?
There are, I mean, here's an example. We work with a pension fund in town. It's a grocery guys. It's UFCW. And so in our area in Minneapolis, the number of union grocery stores is not growing. The number of, we have this one called Hy-Vee. I don't know if you all have heard of it. Hy-Vee, huge non-union shops. They come in, it's like they were building them when I was asleep. It was like there's 12 of them. And all of a sudden, so the number of contributing employers, they've got intense competition. And so they kind of, about a few years ago, said, man, this is not going to be good because we are going to start to have to close our stores. Our labor costs are up here. Hy-Vees are here. So what we're going to do is we're basically going to cap and freeze our defined benefit pension plan. And we are going to basically freeze it, so no new participants. And what we're going to do is we're going to put in enough money to keep it funded until it's all, so we're basically got this bucket that we need to fill up with money until it's all the way, until we run it down. And that was kind of the way they're solving their withdrawal liability.
How do you sell that?
It was really challenging. It takes some progressive thinking.
Yeah.
The variable benefit accrual formula that I talked about that the National Pension Fund does, I think is pretty aggressive. It's pretty out there in terms of what, not to be disparaging, but in terms of how labor unions think about pensions, this variable benefit accrual was a bit progressive in how they did that. Unfortunately, it's going to take a generation or two for it to really work, for you to really see, oh, that pension fund's finally green, 60 years from now.
The other, proposal that Mike mentioned earlier that's been floated as, it was initially before Congress as part of the Multi-Employer Pension Reform Act that they enacted in 2014. It was the last piece that just didn't go through for whatever reason, was the idea of kind of a hybrid retirement plan, that it's a plan that kind of includes all the positive features of a pension and a 401k and gets rid of the negative features. So the idea would be that you would be allowed to establish one of these plans, and there would be no withdrawal liability feature of it. You wouldn't incur withdrawal liability. But the investment risk wouldn't fall entirely on the employee, which is kind of a negative aspect of the 401k plan. So it would essentially be your contribution as an employer would be defined within a certain range, and as long as the funding level remained within a certain range, then you wouldn't have to add more money. But on the flip side of things, the employee's benefit would also kind of be defined within a certain range depending on how well it was funded. So there would be a little more shifting of risk, a little more sharing of risk rather than completely one or completely the other. And that's that final piece, that composite plan that SMACCA and MCAA and a couple other national construction employer associations are trying to get through Congress this year or next year, so that's another option that will give you another tool to use in order to, if you wanted to, say, freeze your pension, instead of having to go to 401k plan, you could go to this composite plan that's a little more palatable to employees than just going to a 401k plan.
Yep, that's how it works.
Any other questions?
How likely is that to happen in the state of Finland for you?
I think what we were telling legislators that the legislative conference that SMACCA and MCA just had last week in DC is focusing on exactly what happened with Central States Teamsters and some of the other plans that have applied to cut benefits and been rejected. Trying to draw a contrast there, that instead of getting to a point where we have to slash benefits, why don't you create this additional tool that we could use. So what we could do is kind of soften the blow for employees instead of having to slash their benefits 40 to 60%, or just go belly up and have the Pension Benefit Guarantee Corporation come in and pay 5 cents on the dollar. Give us a little bit more flexibility so that we can take the situation into our own hands, and as pension fund trustees, we can figure out the most appropriate way to make sure that the employees are still being treated fairly, but employers are able to sell their businesses or get out of the business, and we can attract new businesses into the union construction industry. So I think it has a fairly reasonable chance of passing if you can get elected officials to understand that, but the alternative is not great either. I mean, if the money isn't there, the money isn't there. So
Contractors will be hesitant to contribute to something that's being overseen by the same body.
mm-hmm.
I know that I would
Sure.
have my own separate plan for them, and then have somebody else oversee.
That's true.
Or if this would happen.
So another way to do this, so if you think about it, your withdrawal liability is basically, so imagine everyone in the room gives one pool, big pool of money. Another way that a pension fund has done it, several of them have done it, they call it direct pooling. So Lori contributes and her money goes into her bucket, and if it's funded or not, that's her responsibility. Mine is mine, yours is yours, so we have kind of direct pooling. So if I were a new employer who was going to contribute into this new pension fund with this big pool, forget this, day one my withdrawal liability is whatever, some astronomical number, but if instead I had my pool of money and it reflected my contribution hours, my the investment return, all that experience, maybe you can talk me into a release.
I think that would be a lot fairer.
Right.
I wasn't around when some of these guys were, right?
Sure. Okay, anybody else have any questions, comments? If not, thank you so much, Mike, for coming and educating us, and thanks to all of you who took the time to attend. I really appreciate you taking time out away from your businesses to learn more about the topic. So, thanks, Mike. Okay, I'm going to sign off the webcast now, everybody. Thank you very much.